Good morning. Good morning. It's great to see all of you. Can I get a shout out for our students that are in the audience here? Yes. It's amazing to see and so heartening to see our students engage in these moments and these events, especially our students from Chabot, and I had the pleasure to meet two of them on the way over here. Before I move any further, housekeeping, if you've misplaced a pair of glasses, if I look blurry, these may be yours, perhaps. We want to make sure that we get these to the owner before you get in your car. So again, good morning. My name is Ron Gerhard, and I have the pleasure to serve as Chancellor for the Chabot Las Positas Community College District. I want to really also give a shout out and thanks to Beth McCormick for putting on this event and organizing this. On behalf of the district, I'm thrilled to welcome really our community partners, our students, our amazing faculty who are here today as well. And this convening that is subject is really so essential, not only for our environment, our world, but our economy, and really a priority of our Board of Trustees and our districts as a whole. As our district is committed to being really a vital part of this effort, this movement, and continuation of that. And at Las Positas College and Chabot College, we're really contributing the way we can, in alignment with our mission, in creating really degrees and certificate programs targeted to training all of our students to meet the needs of our local employers. That is, green workforce and economy, workforce development. And these programs ensure that our graduates are prepared to succeed in these rapidly evolving fields, as you know, benefiting both them as in terms of living wage careers, upward mobility, but also meeting the needs of you, our employers, in your workforce needs. So as an example of that, just last month, really to highlight, last month at Chabot College, we unveiled a new apprenticeship program working with AC Transit, the apprenticeship program called Zero Emission Bus University, which is a really a first of its kind program in the nation. Received funding from the federal government in excess of $40 million that really engages our students and our apprenticeship students in the program with the ability to learn and gain valuable skills via virtual reality, which is an emerging area. And through programs like these that we're building, we're contributing to build a skilled workforce in this area. And so really excited to be here with you today, to be here to welcome you, and looking forward to engaging in today's discussion. Again, glasses here if you need them. And now I'd like to invite up Sally with the Livermore Lab. Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? On behalf of the Livermore Lab Foundation and all of our partners today, I'm just delighted to welcome everyone who turned out this morning for what we know is going to be a really engaging and informative set of conversations. This symposium was made possible with support from the University of California and a statewide climate action, innovation, and entrepreneurship award that came to Livermore. And so it's really exciting to see it come to fruition. It not only enabled us to put on today's event, but also to support the Climate Entrepreneur Fellows that some of you may have met out in the lobby this morning. They spent a summer at Lawrence Livermore National Lab working on climate tech scale up. So please, I encourage you to talk with them today and the other students that are here today sharing this important work. We've been really grateful to spend the last couple of months working with all of our partner institutions. Of course, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Innovation TriValley Leadership Group, Startup TriValley, and Chabot Las Positas. And a special thanks to Las Positas for hosting us today. It's really an important topic, as Ron said, to try to help the TriValley region position itself for success in advancing critical climate solutions. We have a very full agenda today and did not build in any formal breaks. So just as a bit of housekeeping, I think folks probably found the restrooms and food and water stations out there. Please go ahead and take breaks as needed. So we will be going full bore through the program today to get us through all the amazing panels that we have planned for you. And we did not print out single agenda programs for folks, but there are QR codes on the agenda posters out in the hallway if you want to learn more about any of the speakers that you're hearing from today. And one final note, we did build in time for questions with each panel and also following our keynote. So we will have Katie Marcel from Innovation TriValley with a roving mic. If you have questions when we call for them, we'll run up and you'll have a chance to ask a question or two. So with all of that, I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Jennifer Petridge from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. She's a distinguished member of the technical staff there at the lab and also directs the Carbon Initiative team. And one of her most recent projects was as lead author of the Roads to Removal report, which she'll be speaking about today. The Livermore Lab Foundation has been delighted to partner with the lab over this past year to host a series of regional conversations across the country about the findings that she's going to be sharing with you this morning. So we're really fortunate to have her be able to join us today to set the stage for the rest of our morning together. So thanks again for being here. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Petridge.
All right, I'm going to set those underneath.
Yeah, I'll go put these at the check-in.
Okay, great. Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thrilled to be with you. This is a topic that you'll see is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm excited to tell you about the work of really a big team, many of whom are in the audience, so you'll have that opportunity to ask them detailed questions if you want. We're talking about roads to removal. These are different ways that we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There are executive summaries out in the hall if you'd like to dig in a little bit further. But first I want to talk about why did we write this report? Why are we even here talking about climate tech and the scale up?
As a scientist, I know by the time she takes her first breath, 9 billion more tons of carbon pollution will be in the air. When she takes her first steps, wildfires will have burned millions more acres she could have explored. The day she gets her first pet, there are thousands of newly extinct species she'll never meet. The night she forgets to call, the night of her first heartbreak. Her future home floods for the first of many times. By the time a child born today goes to college, it may be too late to leave them the world we promised. Our window to act on climate change is like watching them grow up. We blink and we miss it.
I realize that's a very sobering and intense way to start. But it's what we need to face, that later is too late, that we're facing a truly sobering climate crisis on this planet. But what I want to tell you about today is that there are many opportunities where we, as a community, as a nation, can make a real difference and can make that happen soon. And at the same time, building jobs, building new industries. And the TriValley area is absolutely central to that, largely because of our knowledge of what the opportunities are. And that's what I want to kind of tell you about today. So this is one of the nerdy graphs we like to show where we think about decarbonization. That's a big fancy word for saying we need to get that CO2 out of the air. We need to get those greenhouse gases out of our atmosphere, back in the ground. That's where it started, back in our soils, back deep underground where fossil fuels were extracted. And part of that is electrifying, buying an EV, taking those industries like steel and cement that produce a lot of greenhouse gases and starting to find ways that we can reduce the climate impacts. And all of that work, which is essential, it's sort of 90% of the problem, is in the gray area of this curve. And it's taking down the emissions rate to zero. But the reality is we know it's going to be tough to get to zero. Not everybody's going to buy an EV. Not every industry is going to have a technological solution to transform. And we have agriculture and other industries that are just going to continue to produce greenhouse gases. So we actually have to make up for those legacy emissions which we've created in the past decades, but also make up for the fact that we know we're not going to be able to decarbonize enough. So we have a sort of 10 to 15% solution that's in the green area, which is the need to net remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then when you do that and you balance that out with the carbon dioxide removal, with the emissions reductions, then that's how you get to what we call net zero. And our goal is to get there as a state by 2045, as a nation by 2050. Those dates are coming up soon. And the national goal is that we would remove something on the order of 1 billion tons of CO2 by the year 2050. Start to remove that amount per year. Now, why did we think that we needed to do an analysis of that number? Well, we really want to establish not just what that goal is, but can we make that goal? That was established by politicians, by smart people in Washington and the International Panel on Climate Change. But do we have the resources? Have we got the biomass? Have we got the land, the workforce, the know-how to meet those goals? Well, my colleague Sarah Baker, who's here with us, led an analysis for the state of California several years ago and established in the Getting to Neutral report that, yeah, we can do that for the state of California by 2045. So what we then decided is let's do a whole national analysis. Let's look at all 3,300 counties across the whole nation and try to see if all of those resources exist and what would be the impacts on communities. So that's what this analysis was. We collected folks from all across the country in academic institutions and other national laboratories. Our colleagues in Washington were part of the vetting process. The Department of Energy provided the funding for this work. And it's really a bottom-up analysis. It really is, instead of a kind of modeling approach, we really just looked at what are our resources? What is the existing amount of geologic pore space? What's the existing amount of agricultural land we have to work with? What are the brass tacks? We really tried to avoid kind of finger wagging. This is not meant to be a policy document. And that needs to come, but this is really just to lay the ground of what's possible. A lot of cross-cutting analyses, you'll see that as I go through the talk. But if you want to learn more, roadstoremoval.org is a real easy website to remember. It's also in those executive summaries. For those of you who are educators or students in the audience, I want to point out that there's some great little fact sheets, short videos. If you're ever in a situation where you want to share that information with a class or others, we really tried to bring it down to the level that is approachable for the general public. So, what is carbon dioxide removal? We start with carbon dioxide in the air. I like to make the joke that plants are the OG of carbon dioxide removal because photosynthesis is all about capturing CO2 and turning it into their biomass. That just means, it's a fancy word that means the tree trunks, the roots, the stems of those trees. Now, if we put carbon dioxide back in trees, in many parts of the country and many parts of the world, it will stay there for hundreds of years because those trees are long-lived. But we here in California know what happens to our forests with some regularity, unfortunately growing regularity. That carbon is not always durably stored because we have such a high risk of wildfire. But it is at least initially captured there. We can also increase the amount of carbon that's pushed below ground into soils in agricultural systems. And that's just plants literally pushing carbon down into their roots, sharing it with microorganisms, and there are many processes where that carbon can be stored. And we can encourage that process in a number of ways. All of those more natural or ecological solutions are very important. And I would argue they're things that we can do literally today. It's not high tech. We know how to do those approaches. We start to move into the more tech world when we think about capturing some of that biomass. Maybe if we're up in the Sierras and we're thinning some of those forests that have overgrown, Or if we're on our ag lands in the Central Valley and we're collecting rice hulls or nut orchards that are being turned over, all of that biomass that currently was either burned or allowed to just decompose and be re-released to the atmosphere, we can truck that to a facility where it's refined into various products and we capture the CO2 at the same time. And I'll talk more about that process, but as an acronym, we call that BICRS, which stands for Biomass Carbon Removal and Storage. We can get biomass from other sources, not just ag or forestry, but just simple municipal waste. You probably have a green bin. I hope you fill it up every week. And it goes off right now to probably a composting facility. That's great. But we could actually capture even more of that carbon if we took it to a BICRS facility and we're making hydrogen as well as capturing that CO2. Now, the last kind of CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, you might have heard about is direct air capture and storage, or DAC. A lot of investment coming from the federal government right now for these pilot facilities. You might have heard of there's one out in Tracy. You can go visit, called Heirloom. And these are literally giant fans working in reverse, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and running it across a solvent or sorbent and capturing that CO2 that then can be concentrated. And the whole process is generated to inject CO2 either below ground into a deep geologic storage facility or added into cement or other useful products where we use CO2. So all of these approaches are really mature technology today. There is new tech that's certainly needed, but all of these approaches are well understood today. That's why we could do this analysis, is because it's so well known. So I'm going to skip to the answer. I'm not going to make you wait. The answer is absolutely. We can achieve 1 billion tons of removals of CO2 every year by the time we get to 2050. We have those resources, and we can scale up to build enough facilities to do this work by the time we get to 2050. It's going to cost, though. It's going to cost $129, let's say $130 billion a year. And I like to usually look people in the eye, but it's hard with the lights in here to see, is that a big number to you, or is that actually that's only 0.5% of our GDP. We can handle that as a nation. It's far less than we're starting to pay in cleanup costs of hurricanes and other climate disasters. It's far less than the amount that we're spending on health and asthma and issues that are caused by the air pollution from fossil fuels use. So if you think of it that way, it's kind of a bargain. And I also like to make the joke that what else can you buy for $130 a ton? Like some sand, maybe rocks, not just cheap stuff. So this is a pretty good deal if we're using this to really clean up the pollution in our atmosphere. And the great thing that comes with it is an enormous number of new jobs, 440,000 jobs across the nation, and those are certainly going to be concentrated. And this is an area in the country, I think, that would be the first to sort of develop that new workforce. There are already companies right here in Livermore that are working in this space. So how do we get from here to there? This is our best guess, and I'm going to ask you to mostly just focus on the figure that's on the left-hand side. In the green and the yellow, those are the forest management, cropland management systems. And you'll see that the amount per year of carbon that they can remove from the air is relatively modest, but we start right now. We really do. We start now by sucking up carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in trees and in soils. It takes more time for direct air capture or BICRS facilities to get built. There's serious capital investment needed. So that ramp up is going to be slower. And I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about that and talking about that today. Because those dotted lines in the purple and blue of how we get from today to 2050, those are our best guesses. We really need your thoughts about how to encourage that investment, ask this industry to start to self-sustain. Right now, a lot of investment is coming from the federal government. It's a $2 billion industry. But again, it needs to get to hundreds of billion dollars of investment, and then that industry will be self-sustaining. This is more details about the specific types of processes that we might use. It's a sort of a McKinsey diagram that tells us the cost curve. What I mostly want to just tell you is that for a large amount of the removals that we need, we can do it at somewhere around $100 a ton. That's a bit of a kind of a magic number for the government right now because we don't want to get into the many, many hundreds per ton. We're trying to keep those costs down. To make carbon removals happen with forests and with soils, that can be done for tens of dollars. It's really pretty cheap. And again, so I would encourage that kind of work is what we really need to take advantage of in the near term. And it's starting to happen. So I'm going to go through some maps of where we see the opportunity across the U.S., but I'll go pretty quickly because I want to get to really what the local opportunities are. This is our analysis of cropland soils. I'll admit that we really focused on the large commodity crops, which California doesn't really make. We don't do corn, soy, wheat, cotton, not to any great extent. So there certainly are opportunities here in California. They just didn't make it into this particular analysis. But the key thing that as a nation we need to encourage, as well as here in California, is keeping green cover on the land all year round. And that means cover crops. For the most part. We got a lot of land in the U.S. where growers and farmers are familiar with cover cropping. They like doing it because it keeps their soil healthy. But for various reasons, they don't make time. Or they make time 1 out of 3 years. There could be investments that might come from the USDA that might change that calculus, and keeping that photosynthetic blanket, as it were, on the landscape, pushing carbon into soils is the thing that we think would make the biggest difference. Our forests are super important to continue their ability to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Here in the western U.S., we have sort of a different answer than they have out in the east, where they typically get a lot more rainfall and it's more spread throughout the year. We really need to focus on managing the forests so that they are less likely to burn. Because when they burn, that CO2 is being released immediately back to the atmosphere. So it's a little counterintuitive, but by taking trees out of the forest and creating more space between trees, you make it a healthier forest. It can capture more carbon because it's less likely to burn. So it's when you factor in all of those realities, you get to the point where we realize that we could be removing upwards of 1.5 billion tons of CO2 simply through managing our forests and creating a lot of very useful biomass at the same time, which I'll talk more about in a second. This is a facility where you're seeing they're doing a thinning operation, a logging operation, and there's a lot of biomass that is being removed. Some of it is possibly merchantable timber. It might be going to a product, a long life wood product, like houses or other materials that'll last for several hundred years. That's great. But some of it at this point is really just either burned or allowed to decompose. And that's really a loss in my mind. And we think about sometimes the value that's embodied in that material. And instead of thinking about what you could burn it and create electricity out of, that's one thing to do with biomass. What if we really valued the carbon itself? It's truly so much more valuable in an economic sense than just the electrons that you get from burning wood. And this is a map of California where we've highlighted particular counties that have a lot of opportunity to take biomass and convert it to a useful fuel. I'll talk more about those in a second, but hydrogen's kind of at the top of the list, while at the same time capturing CO2 in that process. And in the counties up in Northern California, I've talked to those folks, they are just literally drowning in biomass. They don't have anywhere to put it. They don't have anywhere to do with it. There are facilities that were burning it to simply make electricity. A couple of those have shut down. There's a huge opportunity to use this material for good. In the southern part of the state, a lot of the dark green that you see down there near San Diego and LA, those are largely because of municipal sources of the waste, again, that I call it the green bin kind of waste, but things that come from usually human sources. So, a lot of different biomass conversion properties. Again, I'm going to point to my colleague Sarah Baker, who's here with us, because she can tell you a lot more about those details. But we can take biomass from different sources. It can be wet, manures, or dry, like those forest wastes. use combustion, pyrolysis, anaerobic digestion. There's a different kind of process, chemical process, that's going to be appropriate to each feedstock. And then produce a number of different products. The product is a sellable product, right? It's something like hydrogen or a liquid fuel, could be heat or power or methane. That has value in our economy today. But I want to remind you, that's not the main reason we're carrying out this biker's process. The main reason we're doing that is to capture the carbon. Because as you're making that hydrogen, you can be concentrating the CO2 and then storing that durably. So that's the real goal here, is that there's a real win-win. We looked at 27 different pathways. I'll spare you the details and just say hydrogen comes out on the top in a lot of cases. We also looked at using biomass to make sustainable airline fuel. That is a national need, and we want many, many millions of tons of SAF by sustainable airline fuel by in the next 10 to 15 years. But overall, we have an opportunity to remove 700 to 900 million tons of CO2 a year through all of these different processes. But it was going to take a lot of facilities. And these facilities, each of these little marks on the graph here, or the map, is really a new one, because we don't have many of these built as yet. We have corn ethanol plants in the Midwest. But these are facilities that would need to be outfitted differently, because they would be doing these pyrolysis, these other kinds of approaches. So finding the capital to build these and to build the infrastructure to support them is a significant hurdle that we're going to have to think about overcoming. I'll say, though, that here in California, again, we've got lots of that biomass. This is just where it is sort of spread across the Central Valley in particular. Most of it, at least in the Central Valley, is coming from agriculture. But again, the Sierras are not far away, so there's a lot of forestry as well. Just show you a couple of images of these kinds of facilities. This is the Phoenix Energy Plant in North Fork in California. And then the Wabash one, we were just over in Indiana, so I was thinking of that one. And these are facilities that are taking biomass and converting it to fuels and have the ability to capture CO2 as well. But again, price tag is something we really need to think about. $500 million to put up one of these facilities is clearly a hurdle. All right, I want to get to our last removal approach. And again, this is carbon dioxide that is at ambient concentrations in the air. Direct air capture literally sucks that in, concentrates it. I mentioned the Heirloom facility in Tracy, California. None of these pilot plants are operating at scale yet. Some of these plants are, if on a good year, going to remove 1,000 tons. That is nowhere near the scale we need to eventually get to. We need to talk about hundreds, if not millions of tons. And that is going to take scale up. But that right now is seeing large investment from the federal government. So this process, as I mentioned, you can use a couple of different technologies. Both liquid and solid sorbents are being studied and being used. At Lawrence Livermore, we have a team that's looking into sort of even the next generation. There are many others who are thinking about those. The big concern with direct air capture is once you have caught those CO2 molecules, to then desorb them and regenerate your sorbent material takes a lot of energy. And right now we're in a world where we're limited by energy. We're trying to decarbonize, right? We're trying to electrify everything in the country. We really don't want to be stealing from our national electric grid to fuel direct air capture. That might slow down the decarbonization process. We absolutely don't want to have that kind of competition happening. So we did an analysis of where in the country do you have the ability to build de novo or totally new renewable energy. It might be from solar or wind or geothermal, but it would be purpose-built for a DAC facility. And it turns out it's mostly in the Intermountain West. There's some opportunities here in California, but they're more modest. And that potential, whether it's up in Wyoming or down up into Texas, is really quite significant, that you could have both the energy and the direct air capture going on in the same place. And also, what I'll show you in a second, the injection of CO2 deep in the ground. So let me skip ahead to that. And that is imaged here. This is just for the state of California, a whole bunch of different regions, largely in the Central Valley, where we have excellent geology for storing CO2 in the ground. And when I talk about storing geologic formation CO2, I'm talking a mile and a half down. These are rock formations that in some cases used to hold fossil energy. In many cases are saline aquifers or below that they're porous rock that you can imagine. It's almost like being at the beach, and if you spill a can of Coke, right, it's absorbed into that material. So the pore spaces that we're talking about injecting this CO2 into are tiny, tiny spaces. But there's actually enormous volume to safely hold CO2. And if the wells are done in the most modern way, we actually have caps of other types of rock formation that hold that CO2 deep within the earth and prevent any kind of seismicity, prevent any release up at the surface. So this is just a map of where the sort of good places are in the country to do geologic storage. Anywhere that you see a dark green color is really excellent. So certainly down in the Gulf states, in the Central Valley, we've got that region up kind of Wyoming all the way down to Texas, also where we just were in Indiana. But there are other places in the country that are less ideal because they just don't have the right kind of rock formations underlying. So the last part of our analysis that is so important, and again here I want to point to my co-author, Kim Mayfield, who did this work, is that we've tried to look at what are the cross-cutting effects of removing CO2 in all these different ways on our ecosystem's health, on our own health, on what we call the environmental inequity justice analysis, or EEJ. And we looked at both risks and benefits. So these are just 3. We looked at over 20 different metrics, but this right here, we're looking at social vulnerability. The folks' kind of balance of their take-home pay and their overall health, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? How would it be affected by these industries? How would soil erosion, how would those forever chemicals that we call PFAS be affected by the amount of new trucking or new industry or phase out of old industries with a buildup of carbon dioxide removal? So again, I'm not going to talk about all those details, but I'll encourage you to look at the report if you're interested in that space. So wrapping up, I just want to say it's so clear to me that there's enthusiasm, there's great opportunity here in the state of California for carbon dioxide removal and carbon management writ large. We have this agricultural core that has an enormous amount of biomass, but also the potential for storage. We've got a lot of know-how. And that's all the way from Stockton down to Kern County. We've got folks who actually know how to drill those wells safely and manage carbon dioxide. We have forests that, as I made clear, and I think you already know, need to be thinned to mitigate the wildfire, and that biomass can be used. And so there are a number of different sort of launching off points that I think that this conversation today and in going to the future needs to think about. How do communities come to decide what's most appropriate? We've talked about what the sort of physical resources are and what makes sense in a little impartial economic analysis. But this is about people's livelihoods, where they live. There's certain folks who are excited about doing geologic storage underneath their land, and there's others who are going to be more cautious. And we need those folks to be at the table and part of the conversation. We need the growers, those farmers, to be part of the conversation, and we need to know what the incentives would have to be for them to change practices. So again, I'll just mention that this is a $2 billion industry. We're down at the low end of the cost curve right now. This is an analysis of how most industries scale. And we need to get out of the formative phase that we're currently in here by proving that this technology works, setting up those pilot plants, building acceptance throughout our communities, but building that acceptance by inviting community members in to have that dialogue and educating, which is why I think it's so important here at Chabot Las Positas that you are understanding that it's need, but also helping to educate your students about the opportunities in this space. And then what we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about is how do we get from here to there? How do we do that scale up? Because a lot of things that we can do in a pilot plant or maybe even at the laboratory scale, we just don't have the time to do a sort of very measured scale up slowly one by one. We really need to kind of leapfrog across scales to get to millions and eventually billions of tons of removals. So I wanted to just wrap up by telling you a little bit more about what we at the Lawrence Livermore Lab are doing in this space. And I'm going to kind of go quickly and just step through all these pieces. The carbon initiative, which Sally mentioned that I am now leading, it was started by Roger Ains, our chief energy scientist, is really an umbrella organization of scientists at the lab who are excited about being catalysts for removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that might be learning the techniques, the new technology. It might be doing these national analysis. For some of us, it's working with communities. We have a lot of folks, including some in the audience, who are working on what we call community benefit plans. And all that work is incredibly important for developing this new economy, the new carbon economy. The other thing that I'll point to us, the team's doing right now is working on what we call MRV, which is measurement, reporting, and verification. When these companies are removing CO2 from the atmosphere, they want to get a tax credit. They want to get it, there needs to be a marketplace for that. But we need to prove it happened. And we need to prove that it happened in a reliable way that the marketplace can agree is socially acceptable. And so just simply developing that framework is something that our team is really focused on right now. We're also focused on a whole series of different direct air capture hubs and decarbonization products. I can't even go through all these, but just a whole, you can see they're all spread across both California and the West. And these are mostly federal investments that our team is playing a role in. And we are not the lead. We are almost always a supporter, and we work with the Livermore Lab Foundation to support industries that are partnering often with academic institutions to try and, again, build up these new opportunities to remove carbon dioxide from the air. These are just a couple of additional ones, a partnership down in with Cal State Bakersfield and with folks out in the agricultural sector, and also looking at the opportunities to do carbon capture and storage from industrial facilities here in the state. So a lot of these are all have really nice reports and things that we can make available to you. But I just wanted to show you we kind of really a diversity of kind of work that we're doing in this space. And we really want to be, as I say, a catalyst, a resource for the community. We really don't need that work to be centrally located at Livermore. We want to bring our help where you need it. So I'll wrap up by just thanking the wonderful team that helped with this report. And if we have time, I'm happy to answer a question or two.
I've got a microphone here for anybody that has any questions for Jennifer. Great, we've got some over here already. All right.
Thank you for the excellent talk. When I give a talk on climate, I talk about the difference between can, should, and will. And one of the things that you have not touched about is the regulatory environment and the permitting timeline and all that sort of stuff, which I heard a talk on a forum on sustainable airfield where there was a person from the Center for Biological Diversity who was opposed to forest thinning, CO2 injection, pyrolysis, and virtually everything you talked about. Wow. And so I would just like you to reflect on that.
Oh, gosh. All right. Well, I want to have those dialogues. I don't want to avoid those. I think they're absolutely important. And you brought up several topics there, but let me start with the permitting in the regulatory space. For geologic storage, we have very, very few of the new what's called Class 6 wells that have been approved by the US EPA. There's a wonderful tracker online where you can look at how all of the current applications are doing. I think the one for the CRC Corporation down in Kern County is likely to be approved in this December. One for our colleagues with the pelican industry up in Stockton, it's probably going to be sometime next year. But there are applications that are in progress. And those wells are going to be really state-of-the-art. There's nothing like them currently. They need to be monitoring CO2 in really, really careful ways that have not currently been done. So I think it's we're on the cusp of seeing a real transformation in that space because the regulatory part of our government it's moving slowly. We'll admit, but that is going to really open up opportunities for injecting CO2 in the ground. Heirloom, the company that's out in Tracy, their CO2 is currently going into cement. Apparently, there's a sidewalk somewhere in San Jose where you can walk across it, but they don't have a way to do injection in the ground yet. That would be true also for our colleagues at Charm who are building bio-oil and they want to inject that. So we do need to be careful about making sure that we're ecologically and geologically careful, and that's what the regulation structures are for. The biodiversity impacts, the things that you also alluded to there with your colleague who doesn't like forest thinning. I'm happy to have those conversations. I think we probably don't have time right this morning, but I'll just say I have a degree in forestry, and I'll say foresters across the country will tell you the right thing to do with our western forests is to bring them back to the stand density that they were originally at when we allowed forests to happen on a sort of normal 20 to 40 year cycle. The native communities in this state have known that for millennia, and so the biodiversity concerns can be absolutely we can be careful about that while still managing our forests. Yeah.
Next question. Anybody else here?
Feng Gong with a startup working on food waste prevention. Excellent work. I know the focus here is on removal. I wonder what is the assumption about the carbon production? So what's, how do you see the importance of cutting down the emission?
Yeah, I try to say that as often as I can, that this is a 10 to 15% that needs to be on top of the big work we knew in simply stopping the emissions. I don't like to say it's the last 10% because we just don't have the time left to do decarbonization first and then do carbon removal. They have to happen at the same time. I would argue they're not competing for the same federal or industry investment dollars. There really is a lot of investment in both right now. It's more about public acceptance and public education that we need both, and we can hold both those things in our hearts and hands, and they're not in competition. I will also just say, though, in all of our analyses, we'd made sure that the carbon dioxide removal didn't somehow cause more emissions. And that's important, particularly in soils. If you're switching to bioenergy crops, you want to make sure that those crops are not actually releasing more nitrous oxide or methane or whatever than the counterfactual scenario, the business as usual scenario with that land.
Okay, another question. Oh, right here.
Hi. It looks like a lot of the work in California is, other than forestry in the north, is Central Valley. What is your experience with the farmers, people in agriculture, whatever, that are going to be responsible for working with you to make these changes?
Yeah, I'll be blunt. What they say to me is, gosh, carbon is not the top of my list right now. Water is at the top of my list. I happen to be down at Kern County right as we had those giant floods. This is now 2 years ago. So they had too much water after having had too little. Both are a problem. and managing water and what we sometimes call aquifer recharge, or literally just getting it back deep in the ground so that it is available for those lean years, is top of list for these farmers. But at the same time, while they're facing a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is changing their access to water, they can no longer burn. So when those orchards need to be cut down and regenerated, what do they do with all that biomass? Well, now I actually maybe as a grower do care about that carbon because I got to get rid of it. So that's where I see their interest. It's not necessarily yet in a opportunity or a money-making sense. It's just, how do I manage my farm in a way that keeps my yield sustainable? I'll just allude to one other really neat thing, and I'm going to point to Kim Mayfield, who's sitting in the audience. We're really excited about new spaces in agriculture that combine decarbonization with maintenance of healthy soils, and that's agrivoltaics, so PV panels that are over crops. And those can actually, in some of the southern and really hot areas of the state, provide some shade the crops need because it honestly gets just too hot and there's too much sun sometimes. And that is also shelter for our farm workers. So there's some really neat innovations that can help growers both make money at the end of the day, but protect their land and store carbon at the same time. I think there's
Great. We're gonna move on now to the next panel. If you have questions, you can find one of us, and we can make sure we get them to Dr. Petridge to answer for you later. But we are moving on. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Good morning. I'm Susan Houghton from the Livermore Lab Foundation. I'd like to just go back one slide, if we can, to the roads to removal. There we go. Yep. Thank you. If you want more information on the report that Jennifer Petridge just talked about, it is at roadstoremoval.org. We also have the executive summary that we passed out today. There are a plethora of videos. You can do a deep dive. You'll be able to do actually a county by county analysis. All 3,143 counties in the United States were mapped as part of that. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. We are on a road show with the report, and Wyoming is our next stop next week. But in early 2025, the Livermore team will be going to Sacramento to specifically work with policymakers, local governments to help do the deeper dive on what this could mean for California. So now we're going to start to do a little bit of a deeper dive. And our first topic is going to be on workforce realities and solutions. And as Dave Mertes begins to come up here today, let me tell you a little bit about him. He is the partner and president of FM3 Research, a well-respected national opinion firm working with government agencies, nonprofits, and businesses. One of their core areas of research is conservation, clean energy, and climate change. That was important to us when we started working with Dave, the Livermore Lab Foundation, in 2020, because we began to partner on a series of qualitative and quantitative engagement efforts that really made us help us identify what Californians thought about climate change, what they knew about carbon neutrality, and how they cared, if they cared, and what kind of information they needed to be able to make informed decisions. Those results have supported the Foundation's community education, outreach, and engagement efforts throughout the Central Valley. 2 months ago, we asked Dave to come back again with his team to do an analysis of workforce. And later today, you're going to be hearing from Kim Mayfield, who is one of the authors of Roads to Removal. You heard from JP that we are just now at that formative stage of the economy. The TriValley's economy of $47 billion. We know that we can take that places with carbon, but we need the workforce to do that. And in order to have a good workforce, you need great training. So that was what the point of the survey was, asking employers what they needed and how we can fill that need. Today, Dave will be providing a short executive summary of those results, and afterwards we'll have a panel discussion with Dr. Kim Mayfield, research scientist at Lawrence Livermore, and the lead author of the EEJ chapter, as well as Dr. Nan Ho, who is the vice president of academic services at Las Positas College. Our panelists will not join the stage until after Dave presents, so please join me in welcoming Dave Mertes.
All right, good morning. Pleasure to be with you today, taking on such an important subject and hearing a little bit about what local employers here in the Tri-Valley think about some of the potential and challenges that are facing the workforce as we try to expand this sector and this work. I'm going to move through some of the key findings of the research fairly quickly so that we can get to the panel discussion, but we'll be happy to have a more extended discussion with any of you who are interested. Some of the key findings that came out of the research are summarized here. And again, I think they reflect perceptions of both benefits and challenges that the region faces right now. The employers that we spoke to were very positive about the Tri-Valley's positioning. geographically being between the Bay Area and the Central Valley, having access to a highly educated, well-trained workforce that's working at some of the foremost institutions in the country on these issues are strengths. But at the same time, there was a shortage of particularly skilled labor that is ready to work in these industries in this regulatory environment to meet the needs of growing industry. And there are a variety of other concerns that our respondents pointed to. Costs. This is a concern across most business sectors these days, but this one in particular. The complex web of regulations that federal, state, and local authorities impose on these technologies, and the lack of public understanding. The fact that for most members of the public, the idea of carbon removal is a subject they have not spent 1 second thinking of. And you've got to really introduce that idea to them before you can get them to think about its potential, both in terms of its benefits for the environment and for the economy. There was a lot of hope that moving forward, there is the capacity in this region to provide the workforce with the kind of training that it needs to succeed. But the participants that we talked to also had some recommendations about steps they think that could be taken that will help them in making connections with that workforce. So the data that I'm sharing today come from a total of 44 interviews that we conducted with leaders in a variety of sectors throughout the Tri-Valley region, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, and elected officials. About half of the interviews we conducted were in-person, in-depth interviews, which were largely open-ended. Asked a few questions, gathered the respondents' perspectives. The other half came from a more quantitative survey where we asked people a series of closed-ended questions and are able to tally some percentages within our relatively small sample that tell us the general direction of opinion among these participants. And so we've kind of combined both elements of the research to share the key findings that we have today. First, as I said before, there's just a lot of appreciation about the strengths that this region offers as a place for new industries to develop. That includes both a highly skilled workforce and also the availability of land, which is something that is a premium in other parts of California. A lot of our respondents also talked about the benefits of having access both to the Bay Area and to the Central Valley and the willingness of people to locate here because of its convenience to those two locations, the presence of a lot of folks who are already used to significant commutes in the area. We asked our respondents about their views of both the green economy and carbon removal technology. Some of our respondents worked in directly related fields, and they had a lot to say. Others are employers whose work may touch on these fields, but isn't necessarily directly involved. But what we found was that all these participants had at least some basic level of familiarity with both California's existing laws about reducing carbon emissions. 81% told us they had at least some familiarity with it. When we do surveys of the general public, we find that number is closer to 60% among Californians at large. And when we asked them specifically about carbon removal technologies and green energy technologies, we saw a very similar level of familiarity. About 4 in 5 telling us that they knew something about those types of technology. We explored the language that we used a little bit to get the participants' reaction to both the terms green energy economy and carbon economy. And when people heard green energy, they all sort of went to the same place. They thought largely about renewable energy, about wind and solar power, other kinds of renewables. They heard the term carbon economy very differently. For some, they thought that was just the status quo. It's an economy that's reliant on fossil fuels, where we're putting too much carbon into the atmosphere. Others thought specifically of existing policies like cap and trade that make it possible to regulate the amount of carbon that's being emitted. And others thought about emerging technologies for carbon capture. So that phrase was one that had a little more diverse understanding than when we talked about the green energy economy. We also offered our respondents a list of words and phrases, which you'll see running down the left-hand side of the slide, which might describe both the green energy economy and carbon removal and storage, and asked them how applicable they thought each phrase was. I don't want to fixate too much on the individual percentages here, but there's some sort of groups of perceptions that are widely shared and then some that are not. At the top of the slide, there's 3 items that 3/4 of our participants said were good descriptions. growing, hopeful, important to the environment. Those are all obviously very encouraging, but also challenging. In fact, there was stronger agreement with that description than anything else. And we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the elements of the challenges. Note down at the bottom of the slide, the one item that everyone rejected, or almost everyone rejected as a descriptor, was unnecessary. So the importance of making this transition was pretty broadly recognized. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through a couple of these. So for some of the challenges that our respondents saw, the regulatory process and the permitting process were something that almost all of them mentioned in some capacity. One respondent told us, it seems like the system is engineered to make it easy to get to no, but not easy to get to yes. It's long, it's expensive, and that disincentive to getting things done was a significant barrier that many mentioned. And a few talked about how in other states the regulatory regime is much less restrictive, and that makes it tempting for some investment to flow places other than California for that reason. There was also a number that noted the tension that exists between California's overall goal of reducing carbon emissions on a rapid time frame and then regulatory and permitting processes that make it hard to take the steps that will get to that goal with the same degree of urgency. There were lots of concerns about costs that our respondents mentioned as well. The cost both to businesses from inputs, capital expenditures, but also the cost to workers, skilled workers who employers want to locate here in a place where housing is about as expensive as it is anywhere in the country. All of those were things that they struggled with, and they noted that grants, tax credits, incentives, anything that can be done to ease those financial burdens will help to move progress forward. In the survey, where we had some closed-ended questions, we specified a variety of specific kinds of barriers that might keep people from further investment in the green energy sector. We had people rate how big a barrier they thought each one was. You'll notice that a lot of the top barriers that people rated connected to costs in various different ways. Capital expenditures are too high, the ROI is uncertain, housing is too expensive, market demand is too limited. But generally speaking, the things that they were less inclined to view as barriers were those that had to do with whether investing in this sector is worthwhile at all. Other environmental technologies are more appealing. Technology is not relevant to my company. Company has higher priorities. All of those were seen as being relatively modest barriers. So when asked what could be done in order to both facilitate the growth of the green energy economy and also carbon removal and storage technology, you'll see a number of the ideas that our respondents suggested here. A lot of it had to do with making permitting and approval processes simpler, more streamlined. Those were things that people saw as being very helpful. And then the same thing that I think a lot of employers in all sectors think would be beneficial. More housing supply, reducing the cost of housing, essential for attracting skilled workers. I'm going to just move us along to talking finally about sort of skills and recruitment barriers that the respondents cited. We heard that almost no one we talked to said that they were not interested in hiring. Almost everybody wanted to hire more workers and said they were having trouble finding workers who had the specific skill sets that they needed. In that context, they embraced a wide range of strategies that might be employed to support their company's hiring goals. From the survey here, you'll see the percentages that said each of the items listed would be helpful. They add up to way more than 100% because most respondents said, all of this sounds good. There's lots of things on this list that would be beneficial for me. Note that the thing that is at the top of the list is vocational trade schools or community colleges, where we are right now. And we've seen this when we do surveys of the general public as well. There's overwhelming sentiment in favor of greater investment in community colleges, vocational and technical education relative to four-year colleges. There's a broad perception that there's a lot more benefit we can get from significantly expanding capacity for those kinds of institutions. And then when we asked people to think about the specific kinds of skills they were seeking from their employees, you'll see the categories that were most often selected here. And again, people could select more than one. At the top of the list were engineering, operators and technicians, IT and data analysis, and basic and applied science research. When we asked people to think ahead to what they might need in a few years in terms of the kinds of skills they'd like workers to have, the list was virtually identical, with engineering once again at the top of the list, basically the same categories there. So I will close with a couple of responses from one of the final questions in the research, where we asked people to tell us in their own words what the coalition of organizations that's brought us all here today could do to help regional businesses advance and invest in the green energy sector. And you'll see just a handful of some of the suggestions that our respondents made about ways they think they could benefit. So I know that was a whirlwind summary, but I'll hand it back to Susan and we'll discuss this more with the panel.
Thank you, Dave. I'm now going to invite our panelists to join us on stage, Dr. Nanho and Dr. Kim Mayfield, and we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion. We've got some questions here we'll start with, and then we encourage you to think about your questions from the audience as well. So, are we all on? Yes, good. Kim, I'm going to start it off with you. We saw a stat earlier that in Jennifer Petridge's presentation about how many jobs we were talking about, 444,000, I think 440,000 jobs. What is the definition of a good job? Talk to us about what that means, because when people see that number, is that a construction job or why? What's the differentiation?
All right. Okay. It's on. So what we did in the report is we thought about what we wanted to use as our benchmark number, and we wanted to be as conservative as possible. So when we report jobs, we specifically only included long-term jobs that would stay there. So actually, it does not even include the construction jobs. It doesn't include construction. It doesn't include project development. It's actually only the operations and maintenance jobs, and then for the bikers, it includes the agricultural jobs that are necessary to even collect and transport that biomass to the facility. So it's only ones that would continue to operate even after facilities are built. So there is also, for example, there's companies down in Texas that are moving their own construction fleet of thousands of employees from project to project. As they build one, they move on to the other. So those are, pseudo long-term, but we did not include those in our analysis just to be conservative.
So when we think about those jobs, good jobs going forward, and we think about what we saw in the survey about the types of things that folks are looking for benefits, help us understand what community benefits are, Kim, and what is important for people to know. We went over quickly housing. Housing was one of the ones. If we can go back to that slide about housing, that would be great. And that was one of the top needs for workers to be able to be workers here. And that's considered a community benefit. So talk to us about the importance of that.
Yeah, so when it comes to housing specifically, on the survey that was done, not only here in the Tri-Valley, but also for San Joaquin County, Kern County, up and down the Central Valley, housing, it did not matter which neighborhood you were looking at. It did not matter which county. That was always in the top 3 for things people were concerned about in previous surveys, and then the most recent one. When it comes to the community benefit plan writing, I can speak to one that we just finished up with the Department of Energy's Carbon Safe Plan. Specifically looks into how will your project impact housing availability. If you are taking down or removing housing, you have to put that back up, or the Department of Energy will not like your project.
Before we jump into the expertise that Nan and Las Positas have, I do want to spend a moment on community benefit plan, because for a lot of people, what is that? Could you talk for a second about the Justice 40 initiative and how a community benefit plan is now really viewed upon by the Department of Energy and the federal government as to being a key component? Yes, you need the technology. Yes, you need the expertise, but it's the community benefit plan.
Yeah, so the community benefit plan is worth anywhere between 15 to 25% of your overall score when it comes to proposal review, depending on if you're at R&D or deployment scale. It's increased once you make it to deployment scale. And the community benefit plan, one of the ways that you can best get prepared to respond to one is to actually have survey data showing what people in that area consider to be a benefit, because it is not the same everywhere you go. We're working right now with communities in Four Corners, Wyoming, North Slope of Alaska, and Stockton, and no area is the same. People have different priorities based on where you live and based on the things that you're interested in and facing. So you find out what the needs are first, and that your community benefit plan works to address those needs. So if housing, for example, keeps showing up as something that is of paramount need, then maybe you're including workforce housing, or maybe you're including some benefit that amounts to that, construction of housing, subsidies for housing. But then also there's some other places where, they say the number one thing that we need is long-term jobs. And so you really focus on employment, but not just employment in general, but local hires was the thing that people in some areas really cared a lot about. For example, in the area around the Navajo generating station, that was of paramount concern. So local hires was one that was really important. And then when it comes to the Justice 40 initiative, there's essentially a map. It's really user-friendly. You can go check it out online. You can zoom into individual census tracts or neighborhoods, and you can see how the Department of Energy scores your benefits flowing to those different census tracts. So they don't want them going only to census tracts where people are already doing pretty dang good, but instead they want them to go to ones where there needs to be equity enhanced outreach. So for example, if you're having a hiring day, if you're having a career fair, a job fair, doing it in that census tract where people don't need to transport themselves out of town, that could be helpful.
Also, what's helpful is obviously having a community college like Las Positas and Chabot to be able to say, we're here to help. And you must have been thrilled to see those stats, Nan, and how it really sets the stage for how important training and education is.
Yes, thank you so much, Susan. It's really wonderful to be here, and I want to welcome you all on behalf of Las Positas College. I'm really excited to see our students, our faculty. We have several administrators here as well. The reason I point out those members of our audience is because that is your workforce and those are your advocates. We stand ready as a district to support the needs of our local industry, and it's especially wonderful to see startup and our national labs here, the full range of needs that you may have for the workforce. So one of the things I thought I could share with you is how we are responsive. We try to be an agile organization, and we sit in conversation very much like what you just shared. Each of you has a different workforce need, and many of you sit on our advisory boards on different types of industries. For example, I noticed the agriculture. We have an agricultural, viticulture, horticulture. We also have engineering, and we have welding and automotive, all of these different advisory boards. So you're already communicating with us what your workforce needs are. What our faculty do, several of them in this room, they listen to industry, and then in those advisory boards, they review our curriculum on a periodic basis. That's part of our natural process as well. And we ask our industry partners, here's a degree or a certificate that we offer for credit. Is this actually still meeting your needs? It can actually get down to the level of the course. So that's really, really important. And it is a regenerative process, and it continues to update. And faculty are very, very interested in updating their curriculum, especially with the hands-on skills that have really come through in these survey results as well. So that's your classic credit type of offering that we offer at both Las Positas and Chabot, and that is one that many of us are very familiar with in our own credentials. But sometimes we need to move faster than that, and so we try to be agile, and there are different opportunities to address that as well. We also have something called non-credit, and this one portion of non-credit is career development and college prep. So much of your workforce is actually growing through our school system. And so we want to be able to reach them and provide them the skills, including several soft skills that are going to be related to your industry. Some a really good example of these two types of programs, engineering technology is a program that we developed here many years ago, and it's actually nationally recognized. And I had the great pleasure to work with Beth McCormick. Where are you, Beth? So yes, on this program, it's nationally recognized and a model system to develop the technologist level in the national labs, where someone can come with a 2-year degree and be able to have a well-paying job, brings them into the middle class, and supports the work of our national lab. So it's a real model system. So in terms of our non-credit, we've had a lot of work in our automotive. We actually see one of our technicians here from the automotive program. So there's automotive. We actually have a fairly new drone technology, which is used in multiple industries for assessment, a lot of the agricultural work we've just been talking about. So that was a non-credit program that's been developed, and we actually have pilots that are licensed based on taking that course and that certificate. So those are types of things that take a little time to develop, but we also are really excited that we partnered with Lawrence Livermore National Lab a year and a half ago or so to write a grant, $500,000 grant to the National Nuclear Security Administration to create a program called REAP, Rapid Education and Placement. And that was a need because we knew that curriculum sometimes takes a long time to do. Education is a system, so it takes time. Sometimes we need to be faster than that. So what we did was the lab, identifying what the needs are in the exact organization that is there, told us these are some 7 different skills that we really need to develop in our workers, not only in our incumbent workers, but also in our pipeline in the community. And so we developed this grant, and we, instead of offering it through credit or non-credit, we actually leaned on our ability to offer community education. So we've already offered that in welding because it is such an important skill. It was showed up on our skill set in the survey as well, to actually do some welding in a very, very fast 8-week or even 6-week session, and actually bring in incumbent workers from the lab and some of our local companies, and then be able to get them out. It was wonderful. So we're developing the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of those skills as well, and hope to keep those moving forward. And the wonderful thing about all of this is that you can take those community ed, which is what we call not for credit, and it can actually segue into credit and credit-bearing courses, which is something that you may also want for your workforce, because many times your salary scales are based on the credential. And so this, again, helps to retain, recruit, and all of your employees. So that's just a variety of different touch points that we have. We're very eager. We stand here ready to listen and to adapt. And what's really exciting, I see Julia Dozier here. So there's another type of education we have, which is called contract education. It's offered through our district office. And so Julia and I will sometimes share things. Hey, I have someone who needs this need. Do you have someone over there that can actually provide that need? And she will do the same as we send it out to the colleges. And one last really wonderful thing, our colleague at Chabot, my peer at Chabot is here, Dr. Forbes. We talk a lot about apprenticeships, because that is basically the learn to earn, learn and learn. So those are developed again with the specific industry that wants an apprentice to be able to make a living, to actually increase their wages through their progression through the apprenticeship. And Chabot has a very, very strong apprentice program, and Las Positas is also developing that. We have one that in construction labor. And we also are actually beginning to develop one in horticulture. So it's a really exciting time, and we, as a district, stand here ready to listen and then to adapt as quickly as possible.
Thank you. You know, Dave, going back to the survey, I was struck that folks are still kind of confused by the difference between a green economy or a carbon economy. It kind of parlays to some earlier stats that we saw, that when you ask people about, going green, everyone can say solar, they can say electric, they can say some of the things. How do we need to look at that going forward in terms of nomenclature and jargon and defining? And what are you seeing that might be different in California and the Bay Area versus the nation?
It's a good question. I think some of the distinctions we saw among the employers that we interviewed here are pretty similar to what we see when we talk to the general public. What we labeled the green economy in this research, the public also understands. They know a lot about solar power, about wind power, about electrification. They're largely on board with those concepts, although the particulars can vary. The term green economy is not generally one that works really well with the public because they hear green and they think the Green Party. They think sort of a more strident environmental politics. Or they think this is what corporations do and they want us to think they're environmentally friendly. You know, NBC rolls out its Green Week of sitcoms and things like that. Clean, renewable tend to be terms that connect with the general public in a little bit more concrete way. It sort of speaks to the reason these sources of energy are beneficial. But whatever we call it, the public is on board with it. When we talk about carbon removal, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, for the general public, for most of them, unless you live in a community like a few here in California where there actually are potential projects moving forward and there have been attempts to educate the public, people haven't heard of it. They haven't thought about it. It can sound fantastical to them to think that we could remove carbon from the air and store it underground. But the sort of default position of most Americans is that we have been able to innovate our way out of a lot of challenges the nation has faced over the years. And so they can believe that this is something we can do. But to get them from that point of thinking this may be a possibility to know this is something that we can do, need to do, and should do, requires, ongoing outreach and communication. And obviously that's something that the foundation has been heavily involved in.
Right. And to your point, different terms in different cities and regions. I know, Kim, you're well aware of how talking about CDR and carbon dioxide removal in Indiana is different from Pennsylvania and is different from Wyoming. And share with us a little bit about the lessons learned that you've found when you've gone across the country as to how we've had to talk about it differently.
Oh boy, have we learned some lessons. Let's see. I'll give a few anecdotes. I think those are the best way to illuminate some lessons. Was talking to some NGOs in Stockton, San Joaquin County area, and when we were talking about community benefit plans and the concept of jobs, long-term jobs came up, immediately got pushed back and said, jobs are not a benefit. Move on. That doesn't count. And I said, oh, okay. Well, moving on then. Let's talk about other things. And they're mostly looking at essentially a community benefit fund for local development. When I was in Wyoming, I was outside of Antelope Coal Mine, and let me tell you, jobs were paramount. They were definitely a benefit. They were a necessity. People were talking about it nonstop, about not only the quality of jobs and also how incredibly clean their air was. They said, when you go back and fly out of Denver, the air quality there is worse than it is here, and we are at an active coal mine, and they were very proud of that. And then when I was in Stockton, the jobs were not the thing that people were caring about. However, air quality really, really, really was. So it can even be about your geographical location. That can make a difference in terms of what are being prioritized. And I think that what has been most effective is to hear what people are prioritizing and then talk about those things, because talking about things that people don't care about, that just doesn't sound like an efficient use of their time.
That's right. Yeah. So I think we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. We've got a few moments. Does anybody have any questions? Katie has the mic and we can answer any. Just raise your hand. And we'll be talking about other things later today. Anything about the survey? We will make the survey public as part of that, so you can get copies of it if anybody has any questions for Dave, Kim, or Nan.
Questions here?
How many students are here who are thinking of going into, I hate to say green career, so I'm going to say carbon type career going forward? Raise your hand if this is of interest to you, any kind of carbon career. See a couple up in there. See, so we've got some education to do. We've got to work on why it is important to go into these new jobs. And how are we going to do that, Nan?
Well, one of the things we can definitely do is we have a great outreach team here, and outreach is also inreach, meaning that we do career fairs where industries come to our campus and recruit for employees, interns. We have a job board, but we also do in-reach, meaning these types of events where we actually have our students in the room to hear what is the cutting edge technology, what are the needs of our region. And these are our students who oftentimes want to stay in the community, which is a really important metric for our business partners as well. So that's one area I wanted to share with you. Just across the way, we're running another symposium in the information technology field, also with students. So that's one of the areas that we can do that. And again, we're very responsive. So when we hear there's a need, and we have lots of partnerships in the Tri-Valley and in the entire region, we're very interested in pursuing those and finding ways to highlight the work that you are doing, and also that you need us to support you with.
Great. And on that note, I think we'll thank our panelists and move on to our next panel. Oh, we have one more. I'm sorry, I didn't see. Who do we have? Oh, sorry. Thanks, Brandon.
The survey is obviously a great source of information. So many of these industries are still emerging, some of them very rapidly. How do you think about developing the critical mass of users of what you produce, Nan, which is educated students? When you don't have one large employer or two large employers who are going to be taking in all of those students, and it's a little more decentralized and fragmented than that, how do you figure out what to teach?
That's a great question. We actually, in the convening that's across the way, that advisory board also has, big employers like the national labs and, some of our big software industry partners, but it also has very small businesses. So in the meetings that we generally have every half year, the faculty and the business partners actually look at emerging trends. That's actually one of the most important agenda topics is what's happening in the workforce? What do you need? What soft skills do you need? What technical skills do you need? And so they use that, and they can actually very quickly adapt it into their existing curriculum, or they can actually adapt their curriculum formally. So we really listen, and I think that's something that, my ask to all of you is, please sit on our advisory boards. Tell us what you need, because we're ready to respond as quickly as we can. Brandon, does that address some of your questions? Okay, we did that actually with engineering technology as well. We did that with the REAP grant. We did that with the life sciences as well. What skills do we need? Yolanda, here we really advise the life sciences. We actually built bio badges in that same way. Little simple soft skills, touch base once, twice, 3 times, 3 courses. You've all developed that skill, and you've built expertise with each level. So all of those touch points are so incredible. And as you can hear, the partners are here. You all are here, and you've actually helped make us, as one of the #1 college and community college.
Can you say that again? What was that again? Let's hear that one more time. #1.
The #1 community college in California. So, but anyway, so but that's just a number. But it's really our heart, and it's our business sense, and it's our responsibility to our community. We stand ready as a district with Chabot, Las Positas, the district, contract ed. We're here.
And that transition from needing corporations to stand up and help gets us to our next panel that Yolanda is going to lead. So thank you, panelists, and let's move on.
Yes. Well, it's great to be here. I'm Yolanda Finchenko. I am the Executive Director of iGate. We run the Startup TriValley initiative, which is one of the ways we accomplish our mission of helping science-based startups succeed here in the Tri-Valley through events like this. We also run a hard tech incubator that is here in Livermore called Daybreak Labs. And I'm really pleased to say we have one of our panelists, Mateen Hanifzadeh, is the CEO and founder of Rushnu, one of our Daybreak Labs companies. One of our most ardent supporters and cheerleaders and fans and advisors is also up here on the panel, Jason Cito. He is a partner at Next 47 and also an investor and board observer with Carbon Capture Incorporated, which is aptly named. It the company directly captures carbon from the air and sticks it in the ground. And then finally, we have with us another huge supporter of what we're doing here in our Tri-Valley community, Debbie Haldeman Wells. She is the Director of Public Affairs, Communications, and Social Impact for a global company, Cemex, and she is responsible for all of this that's going on here in the West and Southwest. So I'd like to start off, I think, actually with you, Debbie, if you could just, and I'll ask each of you to do the same thing, to just talk a little bit about, just briefly, what does your company do, and why are you laser focused on decarbonizing your company's activities and industry?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? There we go. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me on this panel today. So some of you may be familiar with who Cemex is. We are a global manufacturing company of building materials, specifically focused on cement, concrete, aggregates, and urbanization solutions. And right here in California, we have multiple operations, including a cement plant in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. We have a quarry here in Livermore, up 680 in the Clayton area, and we have ready mix batch plants all over the state, and we also operate out of 3 marine terminals. So that kind of gives you the footprint of who we are in the state of California. Why is decarbonization important? So, our purpose is to build a better future, right? We provide sustainable building materials and solutions. And decarbonization is essential for future generations. But we also recognize, there's an inherent carbon footprint in our production processes. And so decarbonization is a high priority and has been for many years in our operations. Concrete, and just real quick education, cement is an ingredient in concrete. They get used interchangeably quite a bit. So cement is the powder, it's the binder that gets mixed in with sand, gravel, and water, and then that becomes concrete, which you use out there for buildings and highways and bridges and so forth. So concrete is actually the most widely used man-made material in the world. It is essential for the built environment, for our society, for the development and growth of our future. But also we have to look at the opportunities for climate change mitigation and reducing our carbon emissions in our production processes. And Cemex is doing that. And I'll go into that a little bit later specifically. But we have very ambitious goals as a company to get to become a net zero company by 2050 globally and 2045 here in the state of California, with very ambitious metrics by 2030. We are a leader in this industry worldwide. We will continue to be a leader and influence the industry for the benefit of all.
Thank you, Debbie. And I'm going to move to you, Mateen, if you could just talk a little bit again about your company, what it does, and why you're laser focused on decarbonization.
Sure. So Rushnu is, we have a vision. I personally been in climate for the past 2 decades. So both in academic and industrial side. And one of the things that I realized after going through all of this, researches and a scale up, was that industries are facing a challenge that is basically mentioned in one of the talks by Jennifer, is more incentive, like having the incentives to decarbonize their operation. So it's not only to force them to decarbonize, but they should have the incentive to do it. So we have the vision to create this incentive for the company. What does that mean? So just focusing on the carbon capture side. So we see a lot of emission coming from industrial facilities. But is it only because they want to do that, like they want to basically emit all of these emissions, or there is no alternative for them? So we have a technology that basically make the decarbonization financially viable for them. And that's the vision we have. And the reason we created this is all because of the passion for the climate. And now basically we have started this into 2022 with just an idea that was validated in the lab space that we basically rented out of Daybreak Lab last year. We filed our patent. This year we are moving toward basically doing our first field project, real project that bring this technology to the market.
Thank you. And now your turn, Jason.
Sure. Happy to be here. Happy to answer questions both now and later on throughout the day as the pet venture capitalist in the group. Next 47, it's kind of a weird name. It comes from the fact that all of our money comes from Siemens, the German industrial company that has done many, many things over the 150 plus years of its existence. In the electrical space, in the gas turbine space, in the medical imaging space, in the train space. The Muni trains in San Francisco are built up in Sacramento at a Siemens facility, for example. Next 47 makes technology investments to help Siemens move from a capital equipment company to a technology company. That's our mandate. We do everything from enterprise software predominantly, but also frontier tech investing. And specifically to today's topic, we help Siemens make investments out of a 50 million euro negative emissions technology fund that they have. And so they're looking at and have invested both in the US and Europe in direct air capture companies such as Carbon Capture Incorporated in Southern California. Another direct air capture company, one of the larger leading ones, it's not yet announced yet, but it's kind of nearby. And then about 5 other investments in Europe, mostly in carbon capture, but also enhanced rock weathering and other types of technologies. Siemens is doing that because they have a net zero target commitment for 2030. They're taking a lot of steps to decarbonize their business across the board, but they also know that they're going to be in the carbon credit purchase market in order to achieve that. So like many companies, particularly Amazon, Microsoft, and some others, they are looking for ways to get early access and a foot in the door for these companies like Carbon Capture and others that are making carbon credits.
Great, thank you. And I think it's such an interesting twist to have a investment fund that is. I mean, the way I got to know you is through SaaS, right? Like your investment in SaaS, and this twist to really leapfrog into getting carbon credits via actually investing directly into hard technology, which is an unusual move for a fund. So, and I think that just speaks to the importance of the problem that we're trying to solve. And also the importance of, like Martine said, incentives. And I'm wondering, Martine, if you could follow up with and talk a little bit about what specifically you're doing to create the incentives, and maybe touch on some of the recent partnerships that you've made in order to do that.
So right now, there are certain industries that are focusing on carbon capture, oil and gas, because they have money, but that's not, to my opinion and to my experience, that wouldn't changing anything like in the future, because it's not all about investing, but making something that is real and profitable is what makes sense. Because it's not, industries are not only oil and gas, it's ag, is water treatment, is steel industries. Not all of them have the luxury of that money, the funding to invest in those projects. So right now, like existing technologies, the most commercially available carbon capture technologies are CCS. Is basically two-step capturing the CO2 from a gas, which is a flue gas, any stream of CO2, and then storing that underground. And that is reliant only on the government subsidies. Basically, the government to pay them as a tax credit to become financially viable. So what we do, we actually do that carbon capture, but we integrate that with production of the chemicals that are reusable by the customers, by the host. One of the recent partnership that we announced was with City of Livermore. So the conversation, when we started the conversation with City of Livermore, we realized exactly that challenge. The challenge of investing in certain technologies that decarbonize their facility is something good to have, but is not all they can do. It's not top priority at the moment. So the way that we changed the pitch to them was, okay, we do decarbonize their facility, but we create these chemicals that you are now paying to buy from other suppliers. We produce that on site at much lower price. And that was one thing that basically make them to become interested in the partnership with us. We did the same partnership with 2 other customers. Right now we are negotiating with one of the largest sanitation district in Los Angeles. We also started a partnership with Silicon Valley Clean Water in Redwood City. So that means that like if you have a technology that can basically make this profitable, scalable for the customer, then that wouldn't be a question for the customer why you want to basically bring this technology to my facility or something like that. And that's what we are trying to do. We are not trying to only do this for water treatment, but we also have conversations started with the steel industries because our technology is flexible. We can produce feedstock that is used in a steel manufacturing process. We can produce chemicals that is used in other industries like chemical industries, polymer industries. So we are trying to grow, but we started with water treatment because we saw like this is an industry that really need this.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like what you're doing is trying to create something that's self-sustaining for companies, for industry to use, because your process actually creates value for them, not just the removal of the carbon, but also a revenue stream or reduction in cost of operations. Like you've already successfully partnered with the City of Livermore wastewater treatment and Silicon Valley wastewater.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Debbie, can you talk about, I know Cemex is doing a lot. So please tell us about it.
Well, to ensure our commitments, we have established a program that we refer to as Future in Action. And what that does is concentrate around 6 pillars. These pillars are what we've developed as a roadmap to get to our decarbonization and goals. And if I could just run through them, I'll be brief. So the first one is we call sustainable products and solutions. And so what that means is we are providing low carbon products to market. We have our own branded low carbon concrete, for example, called Virtua. And it can vary in the levels of reduced CO2 emissions, but it can go up to 70% reductions in CO2 emissions depending on the mix design and the application. And as an example, we've used more than 1 million cubic yards of concrete, or Virtua concrete, here in the San Francisco greater metropolitan area. And then also that includes SCMs, which are supplemental cementitious materials. So those are maybe industrial byproducts from other industries such as slag or fly ash, which are steel and coal, respectively. Our second pillar is called decarbonization of our operations, and that's where we're really focused around developing carbon capture, carbon capture storage type projects. We're looking at developing that type of facility at our Victorville plant, in fact, where our cement plant is. But it also includes alternative fuels, and they touched on biomass earlier, and biomass can be an alternative fuel for us in our combustion process. So we rely less on fossil fuels, as well as municipal solid waste. So there's lots of opportunities to be using alternative fuels in the combustion process to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Also under decarbonization, we're looking at renewable energies, electrification, and some other things like that. And then the third one is a circular economy that kind of wraps these all together, like reusing non-recyclable waste materials, which, like I said, could be an industrial waste, a municipal waste, an industrial byproduct. How do we reuse those and put those back into the economy? So we're reducing our waste overall. And then innovation and partnerships. So kind of similar to what these gentlemen are talking about up here on stage, we have our own venture capital company called Cemex Ventures, and we invest in startup companies that are looking to more efficiencies in the construction industry, in decarbonization opportunities. We partner with academia or other non-governmental or even governmental entities to develop solutions under decarbonization initiatives. And then lastly, promoting a green economy, advocating for a greener economy, and what does that look like and what does it need? Is it working with our policymakers and our regulators, or is it working with academia? So just really promoting that, keeping a sustainable economy, utilizing all the things I just mentioned to promote that green economy. And then I'll just say, I referred to our decarbonization goals earlier. We are validated, our goals, and you can look at our website, cemexusa.com, but we have validated our decarbonization goals through science-based target initiatives, and they align with the Paris Agreement objectives. So I would invite you to look in that more so on our website.
Thank you. So you highlighted an enormous number of activities that Cemex is involved in, and it's really heartening because Cemex is a global company and producing a very necessary material. And I think to the point of what one of the speakers said earlier is, people aren't interested in solutions that nobody cares about, and the idea of eliminating something is unrealistic. And I think what you highlighted is how your industry has identified what can be done and is working really hard on approaching every single element of that. I'd like to, move back to you, Jason. And if you talked a little bit, obviously investment is one of the primary tools for Next 47 to achieve its goals. But I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how are you going about with the tools that you have to get to net zero?
Okay. How are we going about getting to net zero? The quick and unresponsive answer to that is the investment itself, right? Helping these innovative startups at the Series A level, so pretty early, high risk capital, to see if they can get their proof of concepts to start scaling. I agree with the earlier speaker. She said, even the most advanced of these companies like Climeworks and Heirloom and Carbon Engineering on the direct air capture side, which is a space I happen to know the most about. Not saying it's the only right way to do it by any means. They're all still in the early days, and it will be much, much larger, 2, 3, maybe 4 orders of magnitude more in terms of the scale of these facilities to have the effect that's needed. And a lot more improvements on the efficiency. The energy, you can do some really easy back in the envelope calculations on how much thermodynamic energy you need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. It's kind of a college chemistry question. And if you're doing it all through that, it's about 1/5 of the world's energy production. which is just not going to happen, right? We tend to go to war pretty quick over 0.5% of the world's energy production. So I don't see personkind making that kind of a change fast enough. So we need other ways. We need to get that energy down, so spreading risk capital as far as wide as possible is the way we do that. What I would ask the people in the audience to do to help the venture capital community do that is think about the policy and regulatory realities, because I've been doing venture capital for almost 20 years. I was around for Clean Tech 1.0 in the early aughts, which was an abject failure from a venture capital perspective, in large degree because of regulatory problems. On the one hand, half of venture capital goes to tech, media tech and things of that nature, highly unregulated, highly successful. So there's an argument there that VCs do best where there aren't regulations, and I think that's a valid argument. On the other hand, the other half of venture capital that does very well is in the healthcare space. Very regulated, obviously, but somehow or another they figure it out. Not me, I've never been in that part, but I know it's possible. I haven't seen it work in clean tech. I haven't seen it work in energy at a large scale to any sort of significant degree. But it needs to if we want to have the kind of innovations that this transition is going to require. So figuring out how we make the regulatory environment for this, look more like healthcare, whatever that means, I don't know, but such that startups can be successful as opposed to crash and burn as they've done in the past in clean tech is a task still to be done from what I've seen.
Thank you so much, Jason. And that kind of brings me into a question I'd like to ask Martine, which is related similarly to what challenges and opportunities do you see next for Rushnu, and what kind of help do you need to overcome the challenges or to fuel the opportunity?
So a short answer to this question is time. So everything is about time for a startup. So we are running to develop a technology, do R&D, do a scale up, do sales, and it's all by small team. At the same time, we are trying to manage our runway. So being able to bring this technology to the market as soon as possible, finding right customers, finding right investors, these are all of the challenges that I think it's not only for Rushnu, but for any climate startups, especially at this time, like after the election and everything. So everything is become more challenging for us, but we just have to find a way to survive.
And am I right in thinking some of what gives you time is money?
Money is part of it, yeah. Not everything, but yeah.
So maybe funding from sources like the state or the country.
Everything is related. So it's when you go for fundraising, you should have proof of technology. You should have proof of customer. So you need to work on all of these angles at the same time. And of course, money is one of the things that is on top of head of any entrepreneurs, funders.
And it's one of the things Martine said to me early on that I think is a great saying, and I say it now all the time, and it's one that runs parallel both for startups or any new technology development, as well as the problem we're trying to solve here with decarbonization. And time is the enemy. And we need to really, I think we have in this discussion a lot of the resources, the sources of resources that can help reduce that. And so that's such a great point. And I'm curious for you, Debbie, challenges, opportunities, and what do you need to mitigate the challenges or overcome them, and what kind of fuel do you need to get to the opportunities faster? Time is the enemy. What shortens that for you?
Well, that is one of our challenges as well. But I'll start with the opportunities. Actually, we had a recent success working with, or I should say, with Senate Bill 596, which was the carbon neutrality bill for the cement industry that the governor signed in 2021. And I call that a success because they invited the senator, the sponsor, invited us to the table as an industry and worked with us on creating a bill that we could end up supporting as an industry. And then ultimately the governor signed it. So that started in 2021. And that really opened up opportunities for CEMEX and industry to explore real solutions on how, okay, now we have our time frame, like timing, we have the timeline. Okay, now we need to get to work on how are we going to implement the certain milestones as we reach 2045. And it gave us, again, that seat at the table with policymakers, with the regulators, with the NGOs, and others, who are active in that space, and working together to develop what the strategy will be, what the solutions need to be, and are they attainable and achievable, which are also very important. And then we had even more recent success with Assembly Bill 2109 this year that the governor did just sign as well. And it was just one of the many strategies that are going to help us get there to carbon neutrality. And it was our industrial heat recovery bill. And basically what that was saying, it is allowing cement industry and other industries, but we were focused on the cement industry, of course, to capture the heat that we already generate and reuse that into energy generation for our on-site needs. And so that was a huge success as ticking away at getting to that carbon neutrality. But as barriers, so speaking of that, so there are the opportunities, there are barriers to get there as well. Permitting, we talked about that a couple times earlier in the session. So permitting, lots of challenges, and I don't need to go into them because we've already talked about some of them. They're the same for us as well in achieving some of those milestones for carbon neutrality. And then I would say regulatory oversight. And what I mean, or lack thereof, to be honest, there's regulatory agencies that are responsible for implementing the strategies, defining the strategy, and then the state agencies don't even agree, and they compete with each other, and so it gets. And then it takes a lot of time, and then timing not implementing the strategies. So what do we have to permit to? I mean, it kind of just snowballs, right? And so that's another, I think a real challenge that we have out there. And, we're going to need some legislative action for all of these. We do have barriers to get to carbon neutrality, and I won't go into them, and I can answer questions later. But we're probably going to need some legislative policy to help us remove some of those barriers in the future. And then lastly, I'll just mention emerging technologies. There's, we heard about some of them today, but there's emerging technologies in our industry, and they're wonderful and they're really innovative ideas, but they're not to scale, and they're not going to be to scale for the demand in the near future, or even the midterm future. And so I think there's lots of opportunity to continue to look at those emerging technologies. What I mean by that is they're substitutions for the products that we make, basically, to be utilized in concrete or other aspects of this industry. But people need to realize they're not at scale, and the demand far out exceeds what they are able to produce right now.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for a few questions.
Anybody have any questions for our panelists? Yeah, great.
Hi, this question's for Debbie. I was wondering if you've looked at biochar in your concrete, and you also touched a little bit on biomass, and I'm wondering how you touched on it, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on how you're thinking of biomass in your strategy, which one of the byproducts of is biochar as well as energy. But biochar is something that has been researched quite a bit in concrete. So just wondering if you can talk at all about that.
I'm not a scientist, so let me start with that. So I'll do the best I can. So the biochar, are you talking about carbon being injected into concrete? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, biochar
the carbon being injected.
This was something that I wanted to ask Jennifer, but there wasn't time for questions. But she talks a lot about CO2 sequestration as a gas, but we have shovel-ready carbon sequestration and biochar. Also, it can be used on farms for water uptake. When Jennifer talked a bit about the challenges in the valley, and first and foremost, it's water, not decarbonizing. So biochar is shovel-ready carbon sequestration. We monetize it through corks, through carbon credits, and I've talked to a few concrete or cement producers about biochar as a substitute for example, sand in their cement mix. And so I was just curious if Cemex has played around with that at all. And maybe it's not your wheelhouse where you sit, but it did. When you talked about your pillars, it was definitely in that first pillar. And so I was just curious if you've thought at all about it as a company.
I personally, I will just be honest, I'm not super well versed in that particular topic, but I do know that we have been exploring those type of opportunities. But I can certainly circle back with you and get with our technical team. As far as biomass as an alternative fuel, so we use coal and pet coke in the combustion process of heating our kilns. The kiln gets heated up to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and then that is where the chemical reaction from limestone to clinker occurs. And the clinker is the product that becomes cement, the powder of cement. So when I talk about using biomass as an alternative fuel, we already are. I mean, we already use agriculture waste, we use nutshells, we do use municipal solid waste, but there's opportunities to increase that. In Europe, in our plants in Europe, for example, 70% of our fuel is coming from alternative fuel sources, including biomass and municipal solid waste. And so that's being diverted from going to the landfills and then being used as an alternative to that reliance on fossil fuels. So there's a tremendous opportunity. There's some logistics issues with getting biomass to our facilities, but I think that we can overcome those obstacles, but there's a tremendous opportunity to increase the use of biomass, as an alternative fuel at our cement facilities.
Good morning or afternoon at this point, whatever it is. But this would be specific for, I think, Jason, but all panelists are welcome to answer it. From a regulatory perspective and a policy perspective, if you had the proverbial magic wand, what are like the top 3 areas that you would want to change in order to increase venture capital investment security in this space? And I'm saying that because on the flip side of that, regulatory policies have also been a driver towards increasing our path for carbon neutrality. So, and full caveat, I work for a legislator, so I'm very interested on our aspect on this very self-serving question, what we could do to increase venture capitalism and investment in this space.
Okay. I love the question. I love the motivation that's behind it. It makes me feel bad I can't give you a better answer because I don't have, I haven't gone deep into the policy and regulatory change. It varies a lot around the world. Around the states, and this is obviously a global challenge. So I can't give you kind of here are 3 silver bullets answers. As someone who has been doing venture capital for 20 years on both the East Coast and the West Coast, and has some thoughts about the differences between tech and healthcare and why those two play out differently, and also has lived all around the country, including here in California for the past decade, because this, of course, is the center of at least North America for venture capital and startups. Regardless of what people want to think, it always comes back to here as the cycle continues to roll. But the thing I would encourage people to do is get out of California some. One of the disconnects on policy and regulation and just kind of world view that strikes me the most is that really well-educated, well-traveled peers of mine on both sides of the funding table have no clue to what goes on in the rest of the country and how special in good and bad ways California is. We do great stuff with the startup community because of, it's the innovation capital of the world. It's the immigration capital of the world. These are tremendous positives. It's the regulatory pit of the world. right? And we're fortunate that those two counterbalance. But I was having a conversation in the beginning where someone was talking about how awesome it is that the cost of power is so much cheaper in the SMUT region, because it's 25 cents versus 49 cents. I grew up in Virginia. My father-in-law is still paying 5.5 cents, okay? Everything's relative, and California has really kind of got one of the more insular views, and when it comes to policy and regulation, that's a detriment. So get people to get out of the state, and then come back and do amazing things. But I'm not worried they'll do that because it's a great place to live.
Thank you. Do we have time for another question?
I have one, Yoli, sorry. So, and maybe addressing some of the previous question, I think the best policies broadly try to address negative externalities, things like climate, carbon, but create really clear rules of the road that people can follow. And I think your comment, Jason, about the heavily regulated healthcare field, healthcare normally doesn't interact with CEQA very much. Outside of the permitting of the hospital itself, most of the regulation doesn't have a public input component to it. And I think that's a major challenge that decarbonization and climate tech has to face, which is companies come in. In fact, that heirloom project in Tracy tried to make us stop in Livermore and couldn't. And part of that was the property owner, but some of it too is just having shovel-ready areas where companies that are doing demonstration projects, because as Mateen said, time is like oxygen for these companies. Do you have a space? Can we create a space where these companies can come in and say, I need to be up and running in 6 months on a demonstration project because I have a VC who's waiting for the results of that data to be able to decide on go, no go, or I've got a state grant I'm applying for. And so I think I guess it's sort of a question, but I think more of an observation that I'd like you to object to if you do is, if we had in this region an area, a piece of land that was ready to go for these kinds of companies, whether it's Mateen's company or a direct air capture company or whatever it is, that had gone through the permitting, that had done the CEQA analysis, that you basically could flip on immediately for a company, would that be a major attractant for these kinds of companies into the area, especially combined with workforce development and other kinds of training opportunities?
If it has 100% clean energy. One of my other portfolio companies, Carbon Capture Incorporated, about 6 months ago opened up their manufacturing facility in Tempe, Arizona. And the lead reason they were still happy with that, even though they lost out on part of the sequestration attractant that was taking them to Arizona, was the fact that they were able to move to the front of the line and get 100% clean energy commitment from SRP, Salt River Project, the energy provider in Arizona. And it's because Arizona is a big state that can act like a small state from getting things done. And so finding ways to get California to act like a smaller state where it really matters, land is one, energy is the other, clean energy.
Is that I don't know that California is ever going to be capable of that, but I'm wondering about
you can always get better.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Directionality matters, but I guess I'm wondering, can regions and coalitions like the people that you see in this room and the organizers of this event instead act like their own version of small states, given that a lot of the regulatory authority at a land use level is what actually kills these things? It's risk aversion, it's cost, it's time, it's all of that kind of stuff. And if you can get out ahead of that and say, we're creating this purpose-built environment, like the Momentum project up in Contra Costa County for transportation technology is an example of this too. We're building a purpose-built environment for this industry to attract small startups here. The environment's ready, come in, turn it on, build your company here.
No, absolutely. And if my answer to good energy as well sounded like I was undermining the benefit of shovel-ready land, that was not the intention. Getting the basically clear running room from a real estate perspective is a huge positive and worth doing more of. Because that was, visiting sites was the first step for when CCI was looking, and that's all about the land, the real estate. And I was just giving you and if you want to what next, it's that I've seen over and over these clean energy these carbon capture startups, they've got to get clean electrons. Otherwise they're just, burning natural gas to make steam to do the processes, and it's kind of silly. So yes, land for sure. Next step, or the next greatest thing too, is the energy side.
All right, thank you. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so we have our final panel. And as the panelists are getting seated, I just want to give a plug for lunch. Please stay. I know it's been a long morning, but we do have boxed lunches for everybody if you're hungry. Okay, so thank you, everybody. My name is Tracy Owens. I'm a group lead in the Materials Engineering Division at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And our last panel, we are going to cover the L&L capabilities in climate tech. So we want to talk about some of the research that's been going on there, as well as the types of activities and skill sets that researchers involved in this area typically have. So to have this conversation, we have three leaders from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab who have joined us. We have Brandon Wood here, who is a deputy group leader and a center director. We have Sarah Baker, who is a group leader in energy and climate security. And we have Eric Duas, who is the director for the Center for Engineered Materials. And so we want to start off the panel with them introducing themselves, talking a little bit about their work, their experiences at L&L, particularly in the climate tech space. And then I will pose a few questions to them, and hopefully that will get the audience thinking, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Does that sound good? All right. So thank you. So I think I'm going to turn over to Brandon to introduce himself first.
All right. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Brandon Wood. I have a few roles at the lab. Actually group leader rather than a deputy, but my two main roles are one as the director of a center called LEAF, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then I also am associate program lead for hydrogen at the lab. So I do a lot of work in the hydrogen area. I've been at the lab for about 16 years now. My background technically is in computing. So I'm very interested in how modeling and simulation plays a role in this sort of climate transition that we're entering now. A little bit about our center, which I think will sort of frame some of the technologies that we're interested in. So we have, the center is called LEAF, Laboratory for Energy Applications for the Future. And it's really focused on materials for energy applications. We have 4 focus areas. These focus areas rotate, but currently there are 4. One is energy storage, mostly electrical energy storage. So that's where our battery innovation sits. A lot of that work is in solid state batteries. We also do a lot of work in sort of testing and degradation of battery materials. Second area is hydrogen. This is the area that I'm personally working in the most. So in the hydrogen space, we look at hydrogen production technologies, mostly with renewable energy, but not exclusively. Both low temperature and high temperature processes for hydrogen production. We also do a lot of work in hydrogen storage, both underground geologic hydrogen storage and materials for materials-based hydrogen storage. So for sort of compact low pressure hydrogen storage. Our third area is carbon management. So that's an area that intersects with the other 2 guests on the stage and that you heard a lot about already. In that space, on the materials side, it's really focused on both electroconversion processes, so a lot of work in catalysis and reactors for conversion of CO2 to commodity chemicals, for instance. And then also in the direct air capture space and in what's called reactive capture, so the idea that you can both capture the CO2 and convert it into something useful at the same time. Our fourth area is cross-cutting. We call it degradation and sustainability. Part of our core mission at Lawrence Livermore involves understanding materials failure. This is a personal interest of mine, and I think something that really bridges fundamental basic R&D and applied deployment. So trying to predict, understand, and ultimately mitigate how materials fail in the context in which they're expected to be utilized. The other piece of that, the sustainability piece, is really looking at things like critical materials and supply chain issues. We are a national security laboratory, so when we look at energy, we're also always looking through the lens of national security, and one of those challenges involves, how do we supply things domestically? How do we look for alternatives to materials that are difficult to source in the United States? So I think I'll pause there.
Excellent. Thank you, Brandon. That was a great introduction. Sarah, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Sarah Baker. thanks for putting on this event. I feel so fortunate to work with all three of these wonderful people on stage. So I went in. I'm a chemist by training. I went into science because I wanted to do something about climate change. So I've been in this area for quite a long time. And I have a couple of roles as well. I lead a group of material scientists and chemical engineers. And our group works on everything from trying to come up with those early stage inventions, that basic science we need to transform, to create entirely new technologies, all the way to doing analysis to help companies that exist today figure out how much is it going to cost for me to put on this carbon capture system, or where should I locate my next plant? So our group and our team is really trying to do a lot in this space. And another role that I have is as a PI of projects. And in that role, we work with a lot of different kinds of companies. So I want people to know that we are a resource. We've worked with natural gas utility. We've worked with startups. We've worked with major oil and gas companies looking to decarbonize. And throughout all this thread is this idea that for all of these challenges, we need materials. And we need chemical engineers, and I think we saw that show up on the jobs plot earlier. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Eric?
Is it on? Yep, great. I noticed I sat in the wrong seat. Sorry, Sarah. Eric Duas, I direct a center at Lawrence Livermore focused on advanced materials and manufacturing technologies. Been at the lab for approximately 15 years and came to the lab with a background in material science and engineering. Long history, in fact, in 3D printing. And you might say, okay, what the heck does 3D printing have to do with climate and energy? But turns out a lot, we think, and I'll speak to that a little bit later. Very passionate about climate and energy, particularly working where I do, think about impacts for national security, which I think are going to be enormous, and had the pleasure of working with Tracy and Brandon and Sarah, and would love to tell you about some of the technology development that we've worked on together, really with a focus on getting these technologies out of the research laboratory and making sure they're fielded, deployed, and have real-world impact. Our director has this saying, focusing on translating innovation to transformation or impact. That's very important to us. And we think there's a lot of workforce needs in this area. We've experienced some of them firsthand, and of course they transcend what we do at a national lab, and I hope we'll start to engage and offer opportunities to partner with the local communities, including the TriValley.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, so a lot of you gave us a good introduction into a lot of the different research areas in climate tech at L&L. Hydrogen, electrification, some 3D printing and materials applications, as well as carbon capture. Can any of you talk a little bit specifically about some capabilities at the lab in climate tech that get good utilization and where you guys have had good experiences with?
Well, I think Eric and Sarah will probably cover the advanced manufacturing side of this, but maybe I can talk a little bit about the computing. I mentioned that's my technical background. I've led a number of projects in that area, and how do you apply high performance computing and simulation to problems of climate. And I think this is something that the lab has a very long history in, and we do very advanced simulations of reactive systems. It's part of our stockpile, what they call stockpile stewardship mission, actually, which is the reason why we have such large computers, but we use those computers for all sorts of things now. So I think it's a very exciting time in computing. We're sort of at this crossroads where we can do pretty sophisticated simulations under pretty sophisticated conditions. Artificial intelligence, machine learning has played a big role in this. And so we've been deploying this both to looking at materials simulations in all of those areas that I mentioned and the areas that Eric and Sarah work in as well, to try to design new materials, right? Can we simulate a material and a change to a material that is either very expensive to do experimentally or in some cases with sort of godlike control, right? We can go in and do very, very surgical changes to materials in the computer that is difficult to realize in reality, but kind of gives us a direction that we need to go. We've also increasingly been using a lot of those techniques to look at a kind of more systems integration level, right? How do we understand what happens? For instance, if we have a chemical reaction that's happening, how does that chemical reaction then manifest across scales all the way to a system demonstration? And I think that historically a lot of researchers have really focused, and this is the natural sort of way academia is set up. We have been focused on one of those scales, right? So you have people who understand the chemistry really well. You have people who understand the engineering of the systems very well. You have people kind of in between that maybe look at reactor scale. What we try to do a lot of is integrating all those together. So how does one scale impact another? An example, we have an initiative that we started a couple of years ago. It's called Systems to Atoms, and the idea is to look at all those linkages, and also think about it from sort of the top down. If we understand the environment, the operating environment in which these devices are going to behave, that actually changes the way we understand the materials research. So it's particularly important when we start to look at technologies that are connected to renewable electricity, because there's natural variability. There's variability that's over time, there's variability over space, the resources are different, the feedstocks are different. And so when you think about developing materials for technology, you have to take that into consideration. And at the same time going up the scales, and so looking at trade-offs between things like performance and durability. Maybe you choose one material that has better lifetime but poorer performance. How does that manifest? What's the right choice to make for the technology as you expect it to be deployed? And there's no one answer to that, right? So we develop a lot of computing capabilities to look at those translations across those scales, those trade-offs, and do optimization.
Thanks, Brandon. That was an excellent answer. I think computing is going to be really important to solving complex problems in the future, and climate tech is a huge complex, or climate change is a huge complex problem. I don't know, Sarah, Eric, did you have anything to add to that?
Sure. So I wanted to highlight our capabilities in materials for the transition we need for the climate, as well as analysis. So some people at the lab say that we're a materials lab, a materials science lab. I don't know if everyone would agree. I mean, we're also an engineering lab. We do a lot of things. So the capabilities, some of the relevant capabilities in materials science that we have, at least in the work that I do, pertain to electrification. So specifically, how do we electrify chemical transformations? How do we make the products we need without petroleum? And to reduce emissions, we go from using heat to using electricity to drive these chemical transformations. So this is it sounds kind of wonky and maybe specific, but we can consider electrifying a whole host of processes driven by new materials that we develop and discover. So one of the things we're doing is converting carbon dioxide to ethylene so that we don't have to use petroleum to produce plastic. Another example is we're using new catalysts that we discover and develop to take nitrogen from the air to produce ammonia for fertilizer. We can use electricity to drive water purification and waste remediation. So that's one big area of materials capabilities that we have, and a whole host of characterization tools and synthesis tools that are probably of interest to small companies starting out who could use those resources. And then on the analysis side, I do talk to a lot of companies. And one thing that we find that companies would like assistance with is to understand the economics of the transition. So our chemical engineers with the understanding of the technologies and what's needed, they can help companies understand the options available to them. From our local wastewater treatment plant, how do I decarbonize? How do I extinguish the flare that's there on, I think it's airway, all the way to like where do I site my biomass facility in Northern California. So just trying to highlight some capabilities we have and also ways that we can work with companies.
Great. Hard to follow that, but Sarah mentioned some of the technologies we've worked on together, including electrochemical conversion of CO2 to valuable feedstocks, such as ethylene. I'll just give an anecdotal story there. We created what at the time was the world's best performing reactor to convert CO2 to ethanol, and that was really terrific. Achieved that via partnership, collaboration, working with folks like Professor Tom Jaramillo at Stanford and so forth, and talking with companies and understanding some of the technologies that they were working on at the time. Really collaborative effort, but we did that at 1 square centimeter. And the way we achieved that was by control over the local reaction environment. And that's where the 3D printing part comes in. It's a three-dimensional sort of reactor volume, and we could have exquisite control, albeit at small scale. And then what happens when you start to go to larger scale? There's different sort of what we call emergent scaling phenomena that take hold, and you really have to understand those and try to address those early. And how do you do that? Well, you do that through a number of scientific engineering methods, including using computation. You can sort of explore the three-dimensional space at different scales, both time and length scales. And you can do that with, I think, some of the things that Sarah was alluding to, some advanced characterization methods, such as in situ sensing. And so what we're trying to do in this space is say, okay, the academic paper that we published and received some notoriety for is good, but how do you take that to the next step, and how do we get people thinking about the so-called science of scale up? And once you get people thinking about that, what is sort of the multidisciplinary workforce that you need to achieve it, and what is, I think there was some discussion earlier about infrastructure, what are the facilities and equipment that's necessary to support that. So that's one of the things we're trying to do at Lawrence Livermore, create this sort of ecosystem that really welcomes the partnership both with academia, industry, and perhaps other entities as well.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, so exploring different partnerships, exploring technology on multiple different length scales, materials development, computing that Brandon mentioned, as well as economic development and siting and planning are things and capabilities that L&L is involved with in this space. So I want to ask you one more question, and then I think we'll have time to go to the audience for questions. What have you observed at L&L as the biggest barriers towards employing a future workforce in green energy? Any of you guys could answer that question.
I could jump in. Eric mentioned the science of scale up. That's an area we're trying to grow at Livermore. I think it's safest if I speak from my personal experience there. In my academic training before I came to Lawrence Livermore, I had absolutely no idea how to. I knew how to do hypothesis-driven science, but I had no idea how to think about getting what I was doing in the lab to actually matter. And I think that might be I've seen it play out time and time again, where we prove something works, we have that eureka moment, and then we work on the wrong thing to develop that technology for many years. So that is one area where we're trying to improve our competency and improve that scale-up mindset to help the people who work at the lab realize the impact of what we do, but also we're trying to bring that in through like some of the work that Tracy's doing when we bring in students and interns, and just really try to get people to think about how the technology has to perform in the real world, and how that influences what you do at the bench. That's it.
Thanks, Sarah. Did you want to add, Brandon?
Maybe, I mean, it's sort of echoing the same idea, but I think that the national labs, at least the way I view it, they're sort of a bridge between, academic and industry environments. In other words, between, basic research and market deployment. And so that's a very large gap if you think about it. And I think we've been trying to navigate that internally through some of our initiatives, and all of us have had a similar, I'd say, professional journey in coming to the realization of how important that is. But that's something that's not taught, really. And so, we hire mostly highly educated postgraduate, not exclusively, but at least in the areas that I work in. And they come with a very narrow, I would say almost capability-driven focus, where, they do one thing well. They're looking at how to apply that one thing to the problem space that they see. And I think, transforming that mindset into something that's really problem focused. What are the right problems to look at? Do these problems matter? The solutions need to match the problem. And that's a paradigm shift, I think, for a lot of people with technical training like what I have. And it's something that really comes only on the job right now, but we could probably do a better job of anticipating that, I would say.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so having more of a scale-up mindset and kind of figuring out how to design for manufacturing and design for scale and things like that. Okay, so yes, we have time for questions now. Are there any questions from the audience?
Great.
Thank you. Scientists connecting the dots at almost like at a micro level. And my question also connecting back to even the previous panel, because if we look at the climate problem, right, clearly that's where, we're thinking about either the new material or clean energy. And then because my startup is actually doing food tech, we help the food operator to actually reduce the overproduction by doing accurate forecast. Now, we know that not only basically improve their bottom line, but that helps with the whole green gas and the landfill problem. So what I wonder is, what is needed, right, from you guys' point of view, and also from a larger scheme, where how do we, from investment and from like solving problem, step back and connecting the dots to see, okay, all these different new material and carbon removal, and then food waste reduction, how these different means fit in a bigger, right, objective as we try to solve the climate challenge. I just want to hear the panel's perspective on this.
I think it's been said, but it bears repeating. Carbon removal is important, but decarbonization is absolutely the most important thing we can be doing today, and part of that is increasing efficiency. I mean, it sounds like what you're doing is really important. If I understand your question, if we're doing anything related to food waste, not that I know of, but maybe on the end of life of food, for sure, that is a major challenge. And so, thinking about how to reduce landfill emissions, my group creates materials that can do gas separations to utilize biogas from landfills. So definitely interested to hear more from you about if there's a way that we can help.
So by background, I worked 31 years before retiring from Lawrence Livermore. Worked 10 years in the private sector and in academia both. And I've had contracts going both directions. And I've been a retired contractee at Lawrence Livermore for the last 5 years. I was actively involved in technology transfer, and one of the things I didn't hear you talk about was CRADAs. Back decades ago, CRADAs took 6 months, possibly a year, and it gets back to the regulatory thing, that if in fact the regulatory environment is too onerous, people just say, screw it, I'm not going to bother, regardless of how good your stuff is.
Well, CRADA, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, that's a legal sort of partnership vehicle to work with, for example, ourselves as a national laboratory and other entities within the federal government. Great point. And and what I'll say is we've recognized that for some time. We have a new facility called the Advanced Manufacturing Laboratory. The charge of that facility is to partner with the external community. It sits in our Livermore Valley Open Campus. It's really easy to access, in some cases perhaps too easy. We just had a visitor who was testing us for First Amendment audit purposes, if you ever heard that. That was fun. But within the Advanced Manufacturing Laboratory, we've worked with what's called our Innovations and Partnerships Office. Maybe there's some representatives here today. They handle the technology transfer aspects, the cooperative research and development agreements, and they develop something called, they call a master CRADA. Now, the details matter, but we found if our partners are willing to agree to this master CRADA, it can happen in a matter of weeks now. So that's been a great accelerant for us. However, if lawyers get involved and start looking at the intellectual property terms and start to negotiate those, then kind of all bets are off. Another thing that we found is increasingly we're undergoing things like foreign partner review, and those can take quite a long time. We recognize this as a problem, and we're trying to make sure that the folks that oversee our efforts at Department of Energy and so on understand it, and they're certainly doing what they can do to try to address it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Eric. That actually. Oh, I was going to say that. Okay, so this should be our last question because we have to wrap up after this.
This is for Sarah. It's a two-part question. When you compare the cost of ethylene from petroleum and the cost of generating it with electricity from carbon dioxide, how close are you to competitive? And the second part is, does it require a continuous process, or can you track the ups and downs of solar and wind?
Yeah, so this is why we do techno-economic analysis early on, to understand those biggest levers that will drive down the cost of our new transformational disruptive technology. We are not near cost parity for CO2 converting to ethylene when we compare to petrochemical ethylene. Maybe threefold higher, something like that. But the bigger challenges that we face have to do with durability of the new materials that we're putting in these systems. And so that's part of the science we do, right? We take that techno-economic analysis, those insights, and I'm probably talking too long because we're trying to wrap up, but now we take it back down to like, okay, now we need to do basic science on durability of materials. So we're not there yet, but we understand what we need to do, what we need to improve on to get there. And yes, electricity cost is the biggest driver for electrified chemical production. And so yes, developing a technology that can follow those ups and downs would be really helpful, and something we're working on.
Okay, thank you, panel. Thank you, Sarah, Eric, and Brandon. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so hopefully everybody's still awake and everybody is still engaged. I am the last speaker of the day, and we could. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about some of the capabilities that are going on at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Our panel talked about the broad capabilities, and Eric, Sarah, and Brandon did a really good job on covering a lot of the stuff that we're doing in climate tech. But I'm going to talk about a new capability that we're establishing to address the scale-up challenges of decarbonization technology. And this capability is called the Prototyping Enclave. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why scaling climate tech is such a challenge. And then I want to talk about how the workforce fits into that. Okay, so mitigating climate change is so difficult because in order to do it, the solutions to the climate crisis must match the scale of the problem. And currently, they don't. So to understand that, I'm going to give you two facts. The first is that the oil and gas industry is currently the largest industry in the world. The second is that in order to get to net zero carbon emissions, the direct air capture industry would have to be about 1,000 times the scale of the oil and gas industry. So that means these climate mitigation technologies have to be 1,000 times the scale of the largest industry known to man. Think about what that means for the science. Think about what it means for the materials. Think about what it means for the power and the utilities that are required to run these plants. All of the infrastructure and the pipelines that are going to have to move the CO2 and store it. The questions are daunting. So some researchers and technology developers tend to adopt the throw it over the fence mentality. Oh, I don't have to worry about these scaling challenges. The business will figure it out. But a lot of times the business can't address these challenges without a full understanding of the science. And so when everybody's not talking along the value chain, a lot of times deployments are delayed or sometimes they fail. So a lot of promising green energy solutions are facing these adoption challenges. So I'm listing a few of them here. Things like lack of markets and supply chain visibility, things like challenging economics. We heard about that earlier. Costs are a challenge versus the returns that you're going to get from your products. A lack of common infrastructure and commercial standards, as well as sometimes the technology doesn't perform once you get to these massive scales, as well as community opposition, unfamiliarity. We heard about that earlier today as well. So in order to actually mitigate climate change, we have to better anticipate these scale-up challenges. Everyone needs to be talking along the value chain so we can actually deploy technology that can make an impact on the environment. So what exactly do I mean by this value chain? Well, a value chain is basically all the activities that are required to basically create a technology and then deliver it as a product to customers. And so it consists of these business entities like research and development, manufacturing, sales and marketing. And a lot of times scale-up challenges arise when new technologies do not address all the constraints along this value chain. So the new technology has to work in all of these different environments. After research and development, you have to show that the technology performs. Once you get to development marketing phase, manufacturing phases, you have to make sure that it performs at scale. You have to make sure the technology is manufacturable. You also have to make sure that it has clear distribution and supply chains. And once you get through all that, you have to actually make sure that you're actually delivering a product that the customer wants at the volumes that are required and demanded by the market. And so everybody has to be talking along this value chain. Knowledge must be transferred effectively. You also need support from organizations like finance and infrastructure. We heard a lot about policy and government, but we also need training organizations, education, as well as professional associations. These are the folks that are going to develop the workforce and define it. And the workforce is critical to getting these new technologies out. They're the ones that are actually going to be running these plants. And so when everything is working together along this value chain, you can scale effectively. But when it's not, it's very difficult to scale. And so at L&L, what we're trying to do is establish a new technology scale-up capability where we bring everyone together along the value chain to deploy climate tech faster with a higher likelihood of success. And so what we're doing is we're establishing a research program, but also a new facility. And so this facility is basically going to house a program that basically addresses value chain constraints during early phase R&D. So we're going to have the space and equipment to do large-scale manufacturing in wet and dry formulations, as well as materials manufacturing, as well as rapid prototyping and pilot plant engineering. We're basically going to bring together researchers and technology developers with folks along the value chain in manufacturing and sales and marketing to develop the technology together. We are also hoping that this will be a training ground for workforce development. We're hoping to get the local community involved so that we can bring folks in manufacturing as well as operators and technicians to learn about these new technologies as they're emerging into the market. So we're hoping if we work this way, we can work as one value chain to scale, we can avoid workforce silos, we can train faster, make decisions quickly, innovate, as well as adapt a systematic technology development approach. And so we're hoping this facility will be breaking ground no later than 2027, and it's going to be located in our Livermore Valley open campus. This is something that Eric mentioned earlier. He also mentioned the Advanced Manufacturing Laboratory. This is the part of the Lawrence Livermore campus that's located outside the fence, because this is where we can collaborate most effectively with our external partners. And so this facility is going to be located in a field behind the Advanced Manufacturing Laboratory. So the thing that makes this capability new and different is that we are trying to basically systematically adapt an approach to scale. And this is a technology development process. In industry, the technology development process follows these 5 steps more or less. The first 2 steps are where research institutions are most familiar with. This is basically fundamental research, and a lot of activity and funding goes here. And then the last 2 steps are commercialization, deployment, optimization. This is where the business gets involved. This is where you're putting steel on the ground. This is where you're starting up warehouses and things like that. So there's a lot of activity and funding that goes to that phase of R&D. But this middle phase, process product development, is a phase that's less known. So there's less funding that happens here. This is typically what's called the valley of death in technology development. And that's unfortunate because this phase is the most important to commercial success. This is the phase where you start to ask yourself questions like, does this technology, am I actually going to be able to manufacture it? Am I going to actually be able to train a workforce effectively with this technology? Once I scale it, is it going to be cost competitive? And if the answer to those questions is no, you go about redesigning the technology such that you can make the answer to those questions be yes. And so as you mature technology from the beginning of this phase to the end, you're basically scaling it up effectively. And if you do it right, you're actually going to increase your likelihood of commercial success. So this is the phase of R&D where we are going to locate the scale-up and prototyping enclave. So as I mentioned, we have a facility and we're going to have materials and equipment to do large-scale manufacturing so that we can actually figure out what are the right process technologies that we need in order to scale climate tech. But we're also combining this with a set of best practices that I'm showing you here. We're going to supply these best practices to PIs and technology developers to guide them across the process product development phase of R&D. So they fell into a number of categories. So in the process engineering and scale-up category, we're doing things like risk assessment, economic assessments was something Sarah mentioned earlier. We're also doing things like process simulations. When we get to advanced manufacturing, we're basically trying to combine computing with a lot of the work that we're doing. So edge computing, self-driving labs, things like that. And then when we talk about formulation and prototyping, we really want to do rapid prototyping. So 3D printing labs will be available, as well as pilot scale batch synthesis and formulation. So we're hoping that combined, all of this can provide a holistic, systematic, cutting edge approach to scale up, all under one roof. And we're hoping to execute this research program and these best practices in a way that supports a local ecosystem of workforce training, advancement, and development in climate tech. So we have been piloting this program already as a part of 2 active partnerships with DARPA and the UC. And we have found these best practices really do help to speed scale up as well as help to develop a future workforce in green energy. This symposium, as well as a Climate Entrepreneurs Summer Students program that we hosted at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab this summer in collaboration with the Livermore Lab Foundation, is actually a direct result of this work. The folks shown on here are the PIs and the interns that were involved in maturing several different climate techs this summer, climate technologies this summer. They worked on things involving sustainable batteries, sustainable chemicals, as well as carbon capture. Some of the PIs and students are here today. They did an excellent job, and I hope some of you were able to catch the student posters earlier this morning. So that brings me to a summary and a call to action. So decarbonization solutions must be deployed at massive scales. To deploy at massive scales, we have to work as one value chain. The Scale Up and Prototyping Enclave program, we're hoping positions L&L well to bring together folks in the private and public sectors in order to scale technology as one value chain. And we are establishing best practices, partnerships, workforce training programs, and new methodologies to do this. But we also understand that this is just a drop in the bucket. We understand that there is much more work to do in the climate tech space. So we want to ask you for your help. Would your organization like to partner with us on workforce development and scale up of decarbonization technology? And if the answer to that is yes, please scan the QR code and let us know of your interest. That's going to bring us to the conclusion of this talk. I just want to thank everybody for your attention. And do we have time for questions? Okay, and I want to ask if anybody has any questions.
Tracy, how long does it take to go through the enclave process? Talk to us about, I mean, obviously every industry is different, every technology is different, but are we talking years or decades, or what's the vision for that?
That is a great question, Susan. Thank you. I would say it depends on what your organization wants. So we can work with you in a span of 2 to 3 months if you're looking for us to answer one specific question. If you want us to do a specific set of experiments, if you want us to do economic analysis or a siting analysis or things like that. But if you actually want us to carry you across the whole entire phase of process product development, that's going to be more like 2 to 3 years. And we welcome those kinds of partnerships on either end of the spectrum. Anybody else have any questions?
Your first slide, you had the oil and gas industry. You had the oil and gas industry as the thing that sort of needed to be counterbalanced. There's a lot of logic to say you find ways to put them in the business of carbon capture, right? They have the pipelines, they know how fracking works. You know, class 6 wells are basically fracking running backwards. So, leverage both sides of that. Are you thinking of ways to get this facility and the expertise, better connected with that oil and gas industry, or the concrete industry? Concrete is often portrayed as a bad person in carbon, but really you just kind of run it backwards. It can be a phenomenal sink. There's nothing fundamental.
Absolutely. Yes, we welcome partnerships in the oil and gas industry. Total actually was involved in helping us to develop some of our best practices. We do recognize that the oil and gas industry has been around for a long time. They know how to scale. And so we want to leverage their knowledge. And they are interested in decarbonization technologies. So that was a great question. Anybody else? Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. That was a lot. I know. We're at the end here. I am Katie Marcel. I'm the CEO of Innovation TriValley Leadership Group. And on behalf of our partners and co-hosts today, Livermore Lab Foundation, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Startup TriValley, and the Chabot Las Positas Community College District, thank you all for being here. Innovation TriValley, ITV, is at the forefront, as we've talked today, of a $49 billion innovation ecosystem here in the Tri-Valley in one of the nation's fastest growing regions. As the only business-centered regional nonprofit focused solely on the Tri-Valley, ITV is powered by the region's biggest employers, top investors, and community influencers. And just like today's program, ITV brings together the business sector, government leaders, scientists, and educators to solve regional challenges, but also to contribute to global solutions. So we hope you were inspired this morning and that you leave energized and mobilized and are thinking about how you will contribute to this green revolution here in our region. And in the interest of sustainability, we do have food for you. So we have boxed lunches. So as you exit today, please take a boxed lunch to enjoy on your way out or somewhere on this beautiful campus. It's a gorgeous afternoon. And we hope you all have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much for being here.